That's funny, John. You're welcome, David. It worked out great because of Halloween. So vibed with my joke there. Yeah, great. So you actually helped me catch that in advance, David. I went to make the webinar for today, and I thought, oh, let me do an early time. And then I realized it was Halloween, so it's fortunate that I was thinking that way anyway. And had people in the habit for 1 week of coming early. It did no marketing good. That's pretty funny. Tattoos and a backward baseball cap. Or I guess you could do. Mike usually has his on forward, right? To combine Mike, Greg, and get the hat backwards. All right, let's see. So I did what I said and made sure to not figure out anything too spectacular over the course of the week so I could address questions. I do have a little bit of something, things to share perhaps, but let me see here. Let me go quickly for Faith's question, which is fairly simple and straightforward and business oriented, and then I will get into David's 2 questions. He had one from last time and one from this time that kind of get foundational, which I always enjoy and appreciate. So that's good too. Faith asked a question here toward the end, and I addressed it like very briefly, but didn't really. Maybe I mostly just said that I'll address it next time. But so we're talking about, again, the yes frame idea, right? And where we're finding it. I added something here that I'll get to in a moment. The yes frame from last time is the idea that we want to feel like it's plausible or workable, that a question has an answer, a problem has a solution, that there's a percentage of our prospect audience that will say yes in sales situations, that if a person were trying to convince of something or get to do something or just get them to believe in themselves, whatever it might be, that there's a way to look at it where they're going to want to say yes. And then we just have to get the categories right. That, what I just said there, that kind of summary, there's a number of things that are not obvious about it and that we can also kind of project incorrectly onto what I'm saying and get it wrong. One of those is that it comes down to, even though I just said the opposite, it's still very easy to, I think, interpret what I just said as that you want to imagine the person saying yes, or you want to get yourself believing that they're going to say yes, or that a problem will be solved, or that a question will be answered. And that's not quite what I mean. With finding the yes frame that I'm talking about, it's actually something that you can know, because you can get to a point where you can know for sure, in many or all cases, that a yes is plausible and potentially workable, that the return on investment is workable or plausible, or that you're at the point where you can stipulate it up until a certain point, where you're not going to be double-minded about going after the question ruthlessly, going after the solving a problem without second guessing whether you can do it overall and whether you should be working on it. And same thing with when you are dealing with selling something. It might be that 2% of the people that visit your sales page are going to say yes, and you're talking, or sorry, not going to say yes, but that they want to say yes, given a certain frame that I'll continue to explain and we'll continue to look into and answer questions on here. But there's some way to look at it where they want to say yes if, as they're going through their sales letter, your sales letter, their mindset is in a certain category. They categorize you in a certain way where they have confidence in you. They're feeling the problem, perhaps, right, that you're trying to solve. They feel that you're reasonably trustworthy or trustworthy enough to deal with the price point that you're asking, right? Worth a risk, whatever it might be, that they basically want to, at the point where you're reading a sales letter, think about it. There's a way that, logically speaking, you must want to say yes in a certain way, right? Because otherwise you wouldn't want to read the sales letter at all, right? If you weren't hoping, if I'm looking back when Blockbuster was around in physically, right? And I was looking at movies, right? You read the back, so I'm trying to find one to rent, right? Even though I might reject a ton of the movies and not rent a lot of them, or any but one, or even zero, if I don't find anything I want. What do I want when I look at the back of a movie description? Right. This is a great way to illustrate what I'm saying. Additionally, is picture yourself in that situation, or you're at a bookstore and you're looking for a book to read, and you're looking at whatever you do to figure that out, right? Maybe you just read the back description. So in a way, even if someone would observe you and they were to think, geez, do you want to say yes to anything? It seems like you're rejecting book after book. In another way of looking at it, you want to say yes, right? Even if you end up saying no a lot, right? Same thing with dating. Same thing with even people that think they don't want to date. The right person comes around and all of a sudden it turns out they did want to say yes after all. So that's that's what you want to find, right? Is you want to, well, and you can start by imagining, all right, a person does read the back of my book, so to speak, metaphorically speaking, or literally if you're actually writing the back of a book cover. And then you think, then you reverse engineer from there, right? And you don't necessarily have to do it in one step. That's the reason I broke it up by saying, all right, so you're asking, what do they want to say yes to overall? What was the vision that they had in mind? And then what were the kind of categories that you had to get through so you didn't get disqualified? Once you qualified for the vision, once the back cover was like, oh yeah, that's the kind of thing I like. And then you look and then you design, but this, but that. Maybe you want a certain type of story, but you want a male or a female protagonist. I'm just making that up. I realize that people might not be too picky about that, but suppose someone is. Or a book might really appeal to me, but once in a while, there'll just be a very strong political agenda that is against what I'm interested in here, right? I was reading a book series recently and a girl who was a druid just took delight in totally destroying coal mines and in modern days, like destroying coal mines and her father-in-law's oil business. And she was just destroying property that wasn't people's, destroying livelihoods. And she enjoyed it because it was supposedly hurting the earth. And I can't really enjoy that. That's what I mean by political. Really, the whole framing of politics to me is besides the point. It almost confuses the issue. It's just, in this case, just violations of people, their property. And I don't enjoy that type of thing. So that might be a disqualifying category. So the vision of the book, the overall storyline might be something I'm particularly interested in reading about if it's done well. Or maybe I'm reading at the back of the book. And again, I want to say yes. Overall, it's the kind of thing I might like in the fantasy section or mystery section, but say in the fantasy section. But it turns out that there's a whole bunch of characters and they're all competing and the story doesn't focus on any one of them, right? Like Game of Thrones. That doesn't appeal to me. I like something where it's really particularly focused, typically on one character or at least a group that I tend to like, one or more of them, and it follows them. That doesn't skip all around and have a whole, I don't enjoy the whole tapestry so much as I enjoy looking through the eyes of one character or one or more characters that I like, right? That's me. And so the book has to, again, there's an overall vision and then it has to tick off certain categories for me. And that's the kind of an overall summary of what we're talking. All right. So with Faith, her question is, I like this behave as if they want to say it, right? This idea. But practically, she asks, how do I, as a startup founder, for example, feel that the investor wants to say yes to investing in the business, especially when in the industry there's such a high rate of failure? So a lot of what I just said there, and I might have said some of this after she asked her question as well in the previous webinar, not before. But regardless, the question kind of brings out how easy it is to mistake what I'm saying or mischaracterize or misrepresent it to some degree. I'm not necessarily accusing Faith in particular of doing this or not, but it's on the borderline of potentially doing that. At least it brings up the issue of, I'm not saying that you behave as if I did, in a sense, say behave as if they want to say yes, but it's maybe a little bit of a nuance separate from that, right? What I'm really wanting to do, I'm going to repeat myself for a second, but then I'll try to explain it using this particular example, which will be a little bit new, additional detail. So if I'm a startup and I want people to invest in my business, right? I'm a contestant on Shark Tank, of course, or I'm just having dinner with someone that might invest. I'm not trying to get myself in a mindset or even that they want to say yes. I grant that exactly the way that you phrased it is a little bit of what I might want to do, behaving as if they want to say yes. But it's not quite that I behave as if they want to say yes. I behave as if that it's very plausible that they want to say yes. But I do cater to that. That, again, very possibly even said the exact phrase that she's saying in my webinar. I don't remember exactly how I worded things. Where, in a sense, yeah, you do want to behave as if they want to say it. But that behavior flows from, so specifically with an investor, the very fact that they're an investor, right, calling them an investor, that implies something. What does an investor obviously want and need to do to be an investor is to invest, right? Same way that I'm at Barnes and Noble, there's a huge failure rate with books and appealing to me, just like all, right, presumably, where if you're browsing through Barnes and Noble, you're going to reject most of the book, right? But on the other hand, I'm there to buy a book. That's what we're talking about. We want to find that, right? What got me there, right? We want to feel and realize that, wait, I do want to say it, right? As a guy in your teens or 20s, it can feel like women want to say no to you. But then you look around and think, well, a ton of people are married, right? Roughly half of people. And virtually everyone in their 20s, at least, is not like just had sex at some point. So they obviously want to say yes, right? In some way, shape or form, even if they're saying no a lot. And you can couple those two truths, right? What we want to do is look at both of those truths together, but we, for a moment, want to be, when we want to look at them together, which also means we need to look at them separately, which means that we need to look at the yes in a vacuum as part of our thinking. And then we can alchemize it or put it together with the reasons why they say no. But we can't really properly see why they're saying no in terms of category or in terms of like the lock, the tumbler is not in the right place. If we don't see the yes overall, then the no looks like it's foundational and it looks like it's like unbeatable. It's too overpowering. And that's actually, again, and the good news is that's actually false, right? What's foundational in a certain way of looking at it is that I do want to say yes, right? I must be at Barnes and Noble because I want to get a book. Even if I walk out without getting a book, I wanted to get one. I wanted to see something I wanted, just like someone who's shopping, right? There was that funny incident I related a while ago or early on when I was meeting my wife and we were in Russia and we were looking around and we were looking at some shoe stores, the kinds of things you do when you're first dating someone, you go to shoe stores. Of course, ideally you continue to do that later on. But anyhow, there was all these shoes and she was looking around at the shoes. And then she, after a while, she said with all seriousness, "Oh, it must not be the season for shoes. And then we can leave." And I thought that was very funny, right? Because it's me is not really someone that's in that mode of shopping or not really look at shopping in that way of doing reconnaissance and where it's more something that you do and whatever the best shoes are, you basically pick them, right? It's like in advance, I know I want to get something as long as it won't make me like the laughing stock of the society. That's like the bar I'm trying to get over when I'm getting clothes, not like, which is different than buying a book, right? I might walk out without getting a book, but if I go to get shoes, it's very likely I'm going to get shoes at that store. As long as it roughly fits and doesn't look like a clown, then that's good enough. Anyway, the overall thing is that she still wanted to say, in a sense. Can you feel how if you don't stop and recognize that and isolate that out, that yes, then by accident, by default, it's going to seep in there that you feel like the person's a no and has to be pushed or begged or cajoled, or you have to get lucky, or you just feel helpless in some way, right? When default is against you, there's a certain, like time is against you, the current's against you, the fundamental foundation is against you, right? If you accidentally, without realizing it, believe that they want to say no. And I know what that's like in many areas of life, many instances, many ways. But I gave the example when you're a teenage guy and you just, or even later than that, and you just feel like they want to say no. And then you feel more misogynistic, antagonistic, right? Spiral in the way that you operate, in the way that you respond and plan and think and represent it in your mind. So clearly this person, literally, they're an investor, right? It's like being a shopper at Barnes and Noble. They literally want to say yes. So that's how you figure out everything I just said is how you figure out they want to say yes in that sense, right? You can think of analogies like I gave you with shopping at Barnes and Noble, like I gave you looking for shoes, right? No matter how much it looks like you might want to reject, by the fact that you mostly do reject a particular shoe every time you look at it in a book, you're there in the first place to say yes. And that's the real insight. And it's a huge actual difference in practice in how you operate and think. Because what you do is you think, all right, well, obviously this person wants to say yes. This investor is actually meeting with, they've already spending their time and their whole frame, their whole career, or aspect of what they're doing, maybe not their whole career, is that they're an investor. So if it's unlikely, all that means is it's unlikely that people click together the categories that are necessary for the person to say. And then Mahai asked as well, I think it was, it must have been the previous webinar, of course, there were questions that I was seeing for this one, asked, how do you find those categories? But remember the way that I talk about finding anything is I tend to focus on standing in the right place rather than frantically rummaging around, right? So you can frantically rummage around and look all around and you naturally will, right? No one's going to stop you, including yourself, from looking around carefully and looking at things in different ways. And if you're motivated and persevere and do all the obvious normal things, right, that a focused, reasonably intelligent person who's motivated and wants to accomplish something does, I don't need to tell you how to do that stuff, right? Thousands of people can tell you how to do that stuff. And a lot of us don't really much need to be told, right? How to look around inside the box and what qualities will increase your success can be found by all kinds of good, reasonably good authors, right? including the stop and think about it. It's fairly obvious how to proceed. What is counterintuitive or less intuitive is really focusing on finding the right place to stand, right? And that this yes frame is that. And then trying to figure out the categories that an investor is going to be looking for. How to go about doing that is going to be pretty obvious, again, especially once you're a reasonably proactive, dedicated person. Once you read, either you already are this way or you check by reading 7 Habits of Highly Effective People, you read over Awaken the Giant Within by Tony Robbins, whatever, right? There's all kinds of stuff. And it's all different variations on roughly the same thing. Right. Obviously, you might not figure it all out the first time you talk to an investor, but if you talk to somebody, if you model, like Tony Robbins said, right, you go and talk to someone who's successfully gotten people to invest in them and ask them what they did. Read books by people that talk about that. Go out and try to do it yourself. Go out and ask investors what they look for. None of these should be treated as anything but raw material, as always, but they're certainly going to help you make distinctions and help you find, right? But all that stuff, as I say, is fairly obvious once you're standing in the right place. But the critical thing is that about the last webinar on this is that you're standing in the wrong place until and unless you really clearly, you have to get lucky if you don't clearly and consciously realize, right? To find that yes frame first and come from that, isolate it out, and then look at it in the way that now you're looking for the categories to click in place. And then you'll presumably find them, right? But I don't really have much other than what's fairly cliche to finding those things, except to point out that what gets in the way of people succeeding, other than not standing in the right place, which is a huge thing. But, or I could say one of the hidden things that you could be not standing in the right place about is you put a little bit of an ego ticking clock on how long it's supposed to take you to succeed. Right? You're like, oh, by now I should have succeeded. Right? I've talked about that before. Phrased it a different way of talking about it. At some point you feel like you deserve to succeed. Right? You want to completely and utterly forget about the idea of deserving a result and instead think that the only thing that exists is the result happens or not, right? The very idea of deserving is irrelevant and distracting. It's not that you do or don't deserve. It's that once you start asking a question, you dissolve into nonsense, right? Because it's utterly irrelevant. Just like fairness is in most cases an irrelevant concept. Justice is irrelevant, right? Regarding justice, there's 2 things that may or may not be relevant. One is survival, which shouldn't be treated as utterly foundational. Of course, it matters and it's important in all things being equal. We want to survive. We want society to be more survivable and less dangerous and so forth. But to the extent that we have a criminal justice system, so to speak, you were trying to help survival. Justice is not an ends or relevant really as a means. We're just looking for what's going to encourage people to violate lex. I'm not advocating that amount. I'm saying that at the point where if our goal is survival as an individual and or society and or country, race, town, whatever, then family unit, whatever, then people then conclude that justice is an ends in and of itself or useful in and of itself. But it only emerges from the appearance of justice, the belief in justice, even superstitious beliefs, religious beliefs, which I'm not equating with superstitious, but I'm giving you other examples of beliefs, that anything that kind of furthers practical belief in justice, including any kind of revenge system or criminal economic system where we make it uneconomic or people try to make it uneconomic to violate, will help with things like survival. But the problem is that when you make survival foundational, you run into all kinds of problems. If survival was foundational, then God would just do it for us. If it was the most basic goal, then God could just take care of it. God could easily make us survive indefinitely, prevent any sort of death or whatever, right? Since God doesn't, it's obviously not foundational. Interesting. Of course, someone that wasn't yet clear on the proof of God might say, wait a second, you're assuming God, but no, it's just a matter of whether or not we've established that premise. Okay, so I've dealt with this pretty well. Let me get to some of David's questions. And he's been saying some other things too. I come for the philosophy, but I always get useful sales training. Good times and for all. David, can you give a concise list of your logical steps to proving that God exists? I realize it's maybe a tough thing to do because each step. No, really, I boiled it down particularly well last time, and I realized you wouldn't necessarily want an exact repeat of that. One thing we don't want to do is come into this assuming that proof, the nature of proof, is either scientific or like geometry. Like it's neither a set of axioms that a bunch of experts, bunch of old white men, I'm joking, but a bunch of experts like agree on, right? Like the parallel line rule or the whatever the heck, right? In geometry, you have to literally learn a bunch of axioms, which is ironic because even if we understand that like geometric, or I don't know if it's geometric for this kid, geometry axioms, whatever they might be. Like you're supposed to like basically memorize those, and those are how you make the rest of your proofs, which never made sense to me when I was younger. And then I finally came to understand why, right? Because basically there's like a set of approved axioms that authority tells you is correct, and that makes them an axiom, rather than giving a method for how to make an axiom. The axioms are all obviously true, but my problem was there was other things that are obviously true too that weren't, because they weren't like approved. So it's not like we're starting with a set of axioms and then doing whatever would amount to logical steps from there. Exactly. Nor scientific proof is a sham where you're basically observing and not treating what you're observing as raw material, but instead treating it differently. Basically have to assume naive realism in a certain way for scientific proof, so to speak, to exist, to be valid. Scientific method is a great way to approximate. It's a correct way to approximate that, right? If you come up with a hypothesis and then you test it, both trying to disprove it and or to prove it by having predictions come true and repeating that. The more you repeat, the more you make a hypothesis, whatever it might be. And then, like, for example, the hypothesis that cats give birth to cats rather than oak trees. Contrary to what evolution says, that hypothesis that was true as a law would, of course, contravene evolution, which says that tapeworms give birth to humans. And they say, no, they don't. They give birth to children who 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 then give birth to humans. Okay. Bunch of steps in between. Anyhow, so if we have a hypothesis cats give birth to cats, then scientifically we might try that out and repeat it over and over again. And we might try to disprove it by trying to encourage cats to give birth to oak trees or dogs or whatever in some fashion. And if we were able to do that, then we would disprove the hypothesis. If we weren't, we wouldn't prove it, but we would strengthen our approximation, right? Truly and justifiably strengthen our approximation, make it more and more make sense to act as if that hypothesis was true. Or if we're really clever, we can make the hypothesis that the climate will either stay the same, which is abnormal, without changing, which would be very odd since it always changes, or it'll change and get hotter on average, or it'll get colder. And then we keep testing to see if that's the case. And it turns out it keeps happening. It's amazing. Climate change is most certainly true. Once we define climate change as either the climate gets hotter or it gets colder, or it does something also, which is a change, which is to stay the same, because the climate changes. And therefore, if it stays the same, that's a change from it changing. Any one of those is abnormal. So we could, of course, define things so that all things prove that it's a tautology. Established science is how we don't have to call it a tautology. We can call it established science once the tautology has been repeatedly shown to be true. Okay. I'm willing to substitute reasonably high probability for proving, and happily we don't need to substitute. And as a matter of fact, there's no real room in this case for something like probability, because we're not dealing with replicability and things like if I reach into a bag, I'm not getting distracted when I give these kind of what might seem like tangential points or side things. These are all irrelevant framework and background for what we're talking about. They're all part of in essence, they're part of supporting and helping understand the proof of God. I've already given it directly, so I figure that giving kind of these supporting points or what might seem like tangential points, they're all very relevant to our thinking. The thing that would increase probability would be things like reach into a bag full of marbles that I don't know what the breakdown of colors of marbles are. And I reach in, I can't see what I'm grabbing. I pull out a black marble, and then I do that 10 more times. In each case, there's a black marble. Someone might say, you still don't know. That bag could have 100 black marbles, 100 marbles, 10 of which are black, 90 of which are white. So the probability might really be 90% the applied one. However, if I pull out a black marble 10 times in a row, it's actually reasonable and correct for me to bet that the next one will be a black marble. So some people try to disagree with that, but as far as I can understand, they're wrong. And I think I understand pretty well. When you have to choose how to act, right? If I wouldn't bet my life the next one's going to be a black marble if I could help it. If I had to bet my life, I would certainly bet on it being black. If someone was intentionally trying to trick me, that's a whole different story. That's a different context. I didn't put it in as anyhow. With the proof of God, then what we need to do is find some real basis for understanding the world and for understanding truth. And it turns out that basis is going to need to involve our consciousness field. Like anything, our consciousness field, remember I talked about mental objects. By not understanding the nature of mental objects, which means understanding the nature of objects, when we don't understand that, we are crippled in a way that's going to, if you're physically crippled, it would reach out and mess with you. Have you ever slept wrong and a muscle like in your neck or your hip or whatever is cramped, right? Let's take your neck. What it does is it reaches out and screws with you at times that you wouldn't realize it was with you, right? Or if you work out a lot when you hadn't worked out before and you have sore muscles, then you go to the bathroom and you realize that you're trying to wipe your butt and it's extremely painful or difficult to do. Right? So it reaches out and jacks with you, messes with you at random times. Mental, when it's not jacking with you, it might seem irrelevant. The thing about understanding mental objects and objects, which are basically one and the same, it's going to screw with you constantly when you're trying to think if you don't really understand how they work. And so just like any mental object, our consciousness field it starts with realizing that it's a difference between two potential states or between two actual states or whatever, between two things. We spot its existence by spotting a distinction or a difference rather than, and then our mind creates like a photo positive or whatever of it that turns it into what seems like an object. And then when we try to look straight at the object instead of the difference, that's when we start getting confused. And we realize we don't quite know what it is. We can't quite see what it is. And that whenever we try to define it, it kind of slips through our fingers a little bit. And then people, again, they get confused, they give up, or they project. Typically what people do is project clarity by ignoring the unclarity and pretending as if the object is clear. What's clear is the distinction, and you can only see that clarity by looking at the distinction rather than the object itself. Interestingly enough. If you try to figure out what a tree is, you're going to get yourself more and more confused if you try. Unless either you're going to just say something simplistic and convince yourself that anyone who tries to poke holes in your simplistic definition of a tree is being too deep or come on, stop it, or you're being too philosophical, or that's too deep for me. There are all kinds of defense mechanisms against it. If you realize to explain or define or begin to label a tree, if you think of a tree as a folder that starts with a label for the folder, and then that label or start of the folder starts with a distinction between the difference between there being a tree and there not being a tree in your own, starting with your perception or whatever. Then you start to get an idea of what a tree is, right? A tree is an object that, and then once you understand objects in general, then you can start to fill in qualities of the object in a sense, but you can always fall back to the fact that realizing that a tree, that nothing starts out foundationally as being an object. It starts out as being a distinction, a difference between two things. So your consciousness field can be understood, your beginning of your understanding of your conscious field, your identification of it as like a folder that gets turned into an object and gets labeled with a word. But again, the basis for that, the seed or whatever, is a distinction. And the distinction of your consciousness field is that if you didn't have a consciousness field, you'd be conscious literally of nothing. There would be no relevance to saying that you existed because there would be nothing, right? Your existence would be literally meaningless. There would be nothing to it. So you wouldn't see anything, feel anything, think anything, be aware of thoughts, be aware of smells, hearing anything. You wouldn't be able to be confused, wouldn't be able to ask questions, wouldn't be able to communicate, nothing, right? So your consciousness field is the difference between zero of any of that and having some of it. Now, if we try to either define or grasp exactly what's in our consciousness field right now or exactly what it is, that's when we start to get ourselves tangled up. And in order to answer the question of what it is, we would need to fill in more and more context, right? Because really what something is how it fits into the rest of reality or some other parts of reality enough to give it enough of a triangulation or whatever. So it takes on more tangibleness, more objective object qualities, right? If we think what exactly is in your conscious field right at this moment, we think, well, what does this moment mean? And isn't everything I see, what's that? If I'm looking outside at my lawn as I'm doing now, do I see every blade of grass? I certainly wouldn't want to say I'm not aware of generally looking at my lawn or that I'm not seeing my grass. I am. But am I seeing each blade? Then it starts to get a little confusing what the answer is. However, we get rid of a certain type of confusion when we stop, realize, wait a second, I'm looking directly at the object, so to speak, and that's when it starts to get confusing. And instead, mental objects are like photo positives based on a difference. I can be very clear that I'm not seeing nothing right now, that I'm not fully unaware, that there's no conscious field. That's not how it is. There is a conscious. That distinction is clear and obvious. The object based on that distinction is not. Although various gross qualities of it, okay, I have a sense of visual, I have a sense of memory, I have a sense of being aware of thoughts, I have a sense of tactile, right, and so forth. But the way I check those over is I say, what if there was no such sense of anything tactile or kinesthetic or touch, right? That would be different than how things are, clearly. What if there was no sense of vision whatsoever? That would be different than how things are. That's how I know it's there. So I can see an object like, or something that's somewhat like an object, like my sense of sight is in one sense like a mental object. It's not like a noun, or I guess it is, right? Anyway, but I see the object, but then I can look for the distinction behind it, right? So in essence, we experience the world through objects, but then we do some mental alchemy to understand the world better. We want to be able to use what we see and the objects that we have to deal with intentionally. It's perfectly reasonable. This is similar to stipulating. It's perfectly reasonable to stipulate objects and work with objects. Is not only is it reasonable, but it's necessary and beneficial, and you want to become more clear and skilled about it. If someone said, what would happen if I have a square table and I have 5 chairs, where am I going to pick the 5th chair? I could think about that. And I think about it using objects, right? Thinking using objects is great. If I had 10 plus 3, I don't have to think of 10 as a difference between things. I can think of 10 as an object. Like, for example, a bar, a block divided into 10 1 centimeter by 1 centimeter little segments, not by actually cutting it, but by making a little mark on the block. So it's a 10 centimeter block divided into 1 centimeter segments, and that's a 10. Thinking of a 10 that way is completely useful and even critical for doing a lot of math, but being able to stop and realize that 10 is something other than a block of 10 1 centimeter marked off little squares is important for other activities, right? If we want to have 10 people and I say there's no such thing as 10 people, 10 can only be 10 blocks, that would be a problem, right? So I need to be able to abstract the concept from its object sometimes, and but other times I don't want to do that. I want to work with it as an object. In order to do that well, I want to be somewhat intentional or very intentional, depending on how precise I need to be this is when I say representing something correct. I want my photo positive to be useful and accurate for the task, right? For plenty of tasks, representing 10 as a bunch of 10 centimeter blocks marked off on one overall rectangular block of 10 centimeters is useful and necessary, but I want to be intentional of it, right? And make my representation relevant and good and useful for the task. All right. So our consciousness field exists. It could now. I'm a little bit pretty much just repeating what I said before, but then the next logical step, it has to do with reason, which isn't exactly the same thing as the object, which is blurry in any kind of usage that people use the object that we refer to in our normal speech as reason. It overlaps with that sort of, but when I say reason, I'm talking about there could be 2 possibilities theoretically. One of these is going to turn out not to be a possibility, but before we figure that out, there could be 2 possibilities. One is that the configuration of our consciousness field occurs for no reason. There's no reason behind it, or there's a reason. Reason can be a little bit blurry as an object now, but as a distinction, what we're talking about is, as I hone in on this, when I say a reason, I'm more looking at the distinction of what would it be like for there to be no reason whatsoever for your conscious field to be the way it is? If that was the case, there'd also be no reason whatsoever for it to be the way it is next moment either. So first of all, however things seem to you this moment in terms of how they relate to the past, right? I talk about someone punching you in the face. If you feel like someone just punched you in the face, they're standing there, their knuckles are bruised, your nose is broken, it hurt, they have an expression on their face that looks like they just punched you in the face. You remember a reason why they punched you. All of that. If the configuration of your consciousness field had no reason behind it, what that would be like would be that all of those factors would be utterly irrelevant to your current experience, right? Because the previous moment has no connection to this moment because there's no reason. That would be a reason. And we're investigating what it would be like if there's no reason. So we start to notice how we assume reason for our conscious field nonstop, right? When David typed what he typed, he figured there would be some connection between what he was typing and what meaning I would get. So he figured that there would be reason all over the place. That he figured he could affect my conscious field, right? In a way that was predictable. In other words, that there was reason involved. We can't function for a split throwing out reason, not as an overall blurry concept, but as specifically trying to act as if our consciousness field has no connection to anything, including 1 second ago. Or what's going to happen. I'd have to believe that if I went and punched someone in the face, first of all, I couldn't do that in the first place. That would involve a whole chain of reasons that would have to be disconnected. But even if I were able to go and punch someone in the face, I have to believe that I would have no consequences whatsoever because there's no such thing as consequence because there's no sequence. There's just everything has no reason. Thinking would be irrelevant. Thoughts that I have, beliefs that I feel like I have no connection to anything. Reality, they have no connection to neurons. They have no connection to my brain. There's no connection anywhere. Nothing's connected in any way, shape, or form. There's no reasons, right? So once we look at the extreme, no reason, then we realize that it's absurd in every way, shape, and form in every direction. So there's some reason, some seed. When I say reason, I'm not trying to dump every meaning of reason in every usage that we use. All of the associations you might have to reason, to word reason, right? Every object we have has a bunch of qualities in our mind, has a bunch of association and thoughts to go with it. So you're naturally, and this is part of understanding speech. I'm not being critical as it, but when I say the word reason, it's going to come with a bunch of baggage and a bunch of association. If it didn't have any associations, you'd have no idea what I'm talking about. So that would be a problem too, right? But you may have a bunch of associations that I don't mean right now when I say reason. Try to be very basic and simple, right? And I'm doing it by pointing out the opposite, which is no reason. And remember, guys, as I go into this careful talk here, I'm giving you guys ammunition for talking to other people, or at least helping you talk to other people about this. And furthermore, it's just a good exercise in thinking clearly. Everything I'm saying is a good walkthrough, separate from the topic or whether you already feel like you grasped the proof of God or whatever. All right. So there's a reason why our conscious field is the way it is. We don't know what that is yet. We might accidentally bring in baggage when we say reason, but we can stop and reorient ourselves. So the opposite is just absurd. So something's going on where there's some kind of connection or reason with our consciousness. Now, if we start to investigate reason, which is associated with the idea of cause in some way, shape, or form, we can say, what if now what people will jump to is say something like, can't the reason be the universe? The difficulty with addressing that directly is that it ends up amounting to say, what if Santa's purple? It's hard to answer that directly because it's nonsense. But the thing about the universe causing your consciousness field doesn't feel like nonsense to people. So we have to get underneath it in a certain way. So we might say, how would the universe do that? Or what is the universe? And this is once again where the problem with object comes into play. David said something that might be relevant to this. I'll look at it in a second. But I'm gonna feel around here to try to get underneath this thing. But it's gonna turn out most of this is a question of how long and how fast. And I kind of know what I'm talking about, but it's more of a question of communication. Mental objects photo positives can't do anything. It's going to turn out they can't create anything. It becomes ridiculous. Like a little bit of a parallel or something that kind of is a close indication of what I'm saying is my visual image of a tree can't fall and break my car. Now, someone might say, that's true, David, but the actual tree can. It's going to turn out that actually it can't. And you might say, come on, I'm just looking at it. It does. No, I could show you a movie. I could make a screensaver of that happening, right? I could program something in cartoon, like a kind of cartoon, not a photograph, of a tree falling on a car and crashing into it and breaking it. And that would make perfect sense to people. They'll be like, oh yeah, the tree was heavy and crashed and hit the car and broke it. But actually it's just a bunch of pixels that got programmed in. It's a cartoon. Nothing's heavy in a cartoon. It's just drawn. But it could fully evoke the feeling of the tree was heavy and it broke the car, even if it's a cartoon. But with cartoon, you can see that's not. With real life, people can, because if they're confused about, but they don't feel confused, right? Which is I talked about last time, the real difference in enlightenment, so half in quotes, half not, is being able to feel totally certain about something and still investigate it and still and still genuinely ask the question fully of, is this correct? Let me see what David asked here. David Hood, if consciousness could spontaneously arrive, then it can also spontaneously disappear from any object. I don't agree that the second part of your statement has to be true. I agree that our conscious field didn't arise from nothing. And it potentially a more relevant word there would be I understand, right? It's really not about agreeing or not. And none of this is critical. I'm just discussing, I'm philosophical, which means I might attack ideas and point out a flaw in them, but I'm not attacking a person or implying that they're whatever. So suppose David said, I understand that the conscious field didn't arise from nothing or spontaneously arise. There seems to be a very wide gap between this and therefore supreme universe. Okay, so here's how we close the gap. Well, sorry, I mumbled at the end there. He says there seems to be a very wide gap between this and, quote, therefore supreme universe creating the. Got it. Okay, here's how you close that gap. The gap really is just, as you implied in your original question, a few steps. It's really not many steps, believe it or not. The gap ends up not being wide in the sense of kind of the distinctions necessary for it are not that many. What we start doing is crossing off things that can't be the case, where like either it has to be this or that. I mean, then we realize that it's not that, it has to be this. So either the main thing or the big thing is going to be is in the distinction between the reason for our consciousness field, the reason / cause, right? But we haven't yet made a distinction that's going to make it necessary for us to distinguish between a reason and a cause. So when we start out, it's all kind of one thing. There's no extra distinction, but that distinction comes into play. The distinction between what I'm going to end up calling a reason and a cause, it has to do with, does the reason or does either part of the reason, I'll say part for now, or we'll end up saying something a little bit better, but I need to be careful and not get ahead of myself. I want to assume part of my answer. So let's just say part to be, I want to be maximally vague for a moment. So does part of the reason for my consciousness field, David, and everyone, does part of the reason have to be conscious? Does there have to be a conscious cause going on as part of the whole process? And what we want to do is then take a look at the opposite and say, let's suppose that there's no conscious, intentional aspect to whatever is causing my consciousness, right? So what a conscious, intentional cause would look like would have to be some sort of sense of what your conscious field was about to be, right? And then it gets made, right? Could we get along without that? Could we get along with something not picturing or deciding ahead of time what your conscious field was going to be next moment and then making it be that? And really, I think this is where the rubber hits the road for you, Dave, for basically anyone. And I think this is what you're currently missing. Right. And I know you well enough that you're interested in this and you don't feel insulted. I wasn't really worried about it. I just wanted to say it. remind everyone. Yeah. Anyway, it's really going to fully come down to this, David. So this is where also for where you to look, regardless of how good a job I do with you right now. And I can also bring you on if you want, like talking, but I'll complete my thought here first. It all comes down to can, can we fully have no consciousness and then find a way for there to be a reason for your conscience to happen? And what we run into is the problem of a connection, right? Between you're looking for some reason why your conscious field both is the way that it is this moment and why and how it's going to be state dependent, right? We totally depend on state dependence. That, the idea that our conscious field is related to the previous moment and the future moment. Right? I talked about how ridiculous it'd be with no reason, but I also essentially, by doing that, covered how ridiculous it'd be without state dependence, right? If you let go of state dependence, you basically let go of reason, right? They end up being inextricably entwined, right? No state dependence would mean that, like I talked about, like you punch someone in the face and has nothing to do with the next moment, nothing to do with them remembering you punched you in the face, nothing to do with them feeling hurt, nothing have to do with them attributing the blame to you or anything. That would be no state dependence. So reason is inextricably entwined with state. All right. So it mainly comes down to grasping what it really means to say, or either what a reason could look like, or what it means to try to say that a non-conscious source of some sort is functioning as the reason for your conscious field flowing in the way that it's being created. And I apologize if being created sounds like I'm assuming something. I don't know what to call it if it's there, right? So I'm using created in a sense that is already proven in the reason. Whatever being based on a reason, I could say, is all I really mean at this point by created, right? It's there and it's based on a reason. We already why is it based on a reason? I already covered that, right? If we look at the opposite of it being based on a reason, it's utterly ridiculous. So your conscious field is getting created in a sense of it's being based on a reason. But now we're trying to say that reason is something non-conscious, which means it's non-intentional, which means it has no sense or vision or anything of your conscious field, right? If something's not conscious, then how can it have any sense of your conscious field? It's not conscious, which means it's not conscious of your conscious field. So somehow it's the reason for your conscious field with no awareness of your conscious field prior to it being made, no awareness of your conscious field after it's being made, no awareness at all. So it's this inert, I don't know, is that loaded? I don't know how to say that it's inert, but if it's not conscious, what the hell is it? See, in my understanding, which seems complete to me, I'll answer that in a moment. David asked our cat conscious. But one of the things that's going on with your method is you're getting around, and I don't mean you, in a sense, in a way that like there's no getting around. We need to address this one way or the other, and complicating it. Like in many cases, including just a few minutes ago, I gave like framework and tangential points to give some sort of context to things. That is very often relevant or critical to get more of a framework, more of a context. However, when it comes to distinctions, I don't know if it's like this or in a sense always, but it ends up just blurring the issue to allegedly try to just get context or to say something that seems related. Like when we talk in the other question you had about like with taxes or with extortion being bad, when people start asking questions that seem related, they're actually just confusing the issue. If I was forcing someone to a conclusion, that's different. If I was saying, answer this yes or no, like a lawyer, because I was trying to back you into a corner, that would be one thing. But seeing a distinction, as you can see, I'm a little bit feeling my way into this claim, which is making maybe relative to me not having to do that a little bit slow. But anyhow, there's sometimes it's worthwhile. It's an over the shoulder thing, seeing me feel my way a little bit. One way or the other, regardless of me addressing other questions that may or may not be related, we have to confront this issue on are we going to say that a non-conscious object of some sort or set of objects, in the case of the universe, I guess in one sense it's one object, the universe. In another sense, it's made of parts in people's heads, right? Or people might think objectively the universe is made of parts and those parts can process and make stuff. And why can't they make consciousness? But to what we want to do is start with, we're trying to understand the distinction. And when you want to understand a distinction, then clogging up what you're looking at with stuff is not, you don't want to start. We can do that next in a different way to check over what we're doing or see if it affects our distinction. But we need to see the distinction before we start to mess around with it. So let's ask this. Suppose we have one indivisible unit object, a fundamental part of some sort. It's sitting there. We can imagine it as a cube that has no qualities except for it's a cube, and it's solid, and it can't be divided into anything. Now, again, I'm not a lawyer here. I'm not going to force any conclusion on somebody. What a distinction is not that type of thing. I'm not doing that type. Seeing the distinction I'm creating is not going to cause any problem. It's just a distinction, not a conclusion. So let's just see this distinction. Let's stipulate a cube that has no qualities except that it can't be divided. It can't, whatever. It's a cube. It has whatever qualities a cube inherently has. But again, it's fundamental. It's not conscious. It can't do, can that cube be the reason for your consciousness field now and previously and ongoing? Do you see that distinction? Do you see that it would be ridiculous to just assert, yeah, that cube is the reason for my consciousness field? There's going to be no difference between asserting that and saying there's no reason whatsoever. It's going to dissolve into absurdity in the same way if we were to try to do that. I don't know. David says, I don't know if the cube could be the reason. I have no reason to believe one way or the other. Okay, so ultimately you're going to need to stare at this until you do see it. Of course, we could think around it and look for other things, but this kind of diagnoses in essence, the kind of the issue is because I think we can get to where we can understand that a fundamental particle, it looks like it's loosely defined, but that object, that's when we think about objects. It's like a folder with only based on only one distinction, where the qualities aren't discovered or added in yet. I agree, it has very few qualities, but it's actually defined pretty well in a certain way. We could pretty much distinguish anything from this cube at this point. If I said, does the cube, I just said the cube has no qualities, that would include color. Does the cube have a color? No. Does the cube, or I said there's no qualities. Maybe it would turn out to be absurd. Maybe my kind of initial distinction is absurd. If you say there's no quality, but it has any qualities that are maybe necessary to what I say and no more. So I can't just stipulate it has no qualities, but I can say the only qualities it has is that it's a cube and it's fundamental. It can't be divided into anything. That's all that we're starting with. Any qualities that are necessarily logically necessary from what I just said, it would also have. But then it wouldn't have anything else. So it has no qualities other than whatever is necessary for it. It can't be divided. And why this is relevant is what happens is the way that we get confused about the universe creating a consciousness field is there's all these vague, mysterious things that maybe something can do when it's complicated. This is how all sorts of incorrect ideas get affirmed in people's mind. It's just a simple matter of complexity, obfuscating things. And then you have a kind of magic wand, like you make something gets created gray or is made gray or is confused until it's gray. And then the mind does what it's so good at, is it imposes black and white onto the gray. I know that's a bit abstract and vague, but if I forced you to picture an object that has no further magically vague qualities, then you're going to end up realizing that particular fundamental, simple object cannot make your consciousness feel. Once you are there, then you're going to have a critical building block that's going to enable you to build bigger and more complicated objects until you get to the whole universe and realize you didn't do anything that's relevant to creating a consciousness field as you added complexity. So as we go from that fundamental particle not being able to be the reason for your consciousness, that's going to be our cornerstone. We need to grasp that. What you can do is create for yourself an object or a particle so fundamental, so inert, that it can't make a consciousness field. and then try to figure out what's different. And if in one sense, however you get to it, we can start to build from there and notice that everything that we do to expand or build on that fundamental particle or make more of them. This is analogous to an avocado argument. The point of the avocado, when I said how many avocados do you put in a bowl until it becomes conscious? The point of that is we started with something that most of us at least can feel is not a building block of consciousness. And we realize then that by just having more of them, we don't get conscious either. Like in essence, we're adding zeros. There's nothing about the building blocks of the universe that can make conscious. And just by building more of them and making them more complex, it doesn't make them conscious. And David said, okay, I will grant you that it can't create a conscious field, the cube. David says there's so many things we don't know about the universe. Aha, we don't need to know about the universe. I didn't build my proof of God that way. What I did was show or come to understand that no matter how complicated, something that's not conscious, it can't have a connection to your conscious field. It can't have a reason or causal connection to your conscious field. Imagine, no matter if you have a massive swirl of complex stuff, a whole universe, if all of it together is not conscious, let's not get ahead of ourselves and say, wait, maybe the universe is conscious. I'll get to that. I just stipulated something that's reasonable. Our complex solar system is made from protons, neutrons, and electrons. Sure. But regardless of that, no matter how complex the system, if we stipulate for a moment that it's not conscious, then there's no connection between it and a conscious field, because something that's not conscious has no awareness of a conscious field. It can't envision it to start with. And you say, why does it have to envision it? Of course it has to envision it. You're saying that, to assert that something that has no, again, there's literally no connection. If you're not aware of a conscious field prior to creating it, how can you possibly say to create it? We may say to create it, I said it's the reason. But again, it's made, right? So if we're going to collapse cause and reason into one thing, then one way or the other, by reason, we have to mean something gets it done, right? Our conscious field is there. You're aware. So something makes it. But to say that something makes it, but has no awareness of it before or afterwards, collapses into absurdity. Maybe I could do a better job fully explaining that, but that's where to look. Look for it to collapse into absurdity. Try to make it work. To make something totally unaware. There's no awareness of awareness. There's no awareness of anything. And now we're saying that it's both the reason and the creator of your conscious field with no awareness of it. It's this inert block multiplied by a lot. But once you can picture an inert block can't be responsible for a conscious field, then it might really help you see how a bunch of inert blocks swirling around also can't be. Right? David Hood says zeros and ones by themselves don't make a computer. Actually, you yourself believe that no amount of zeros and ones can make a computer. 1 0 can't make a computer. 3 zeros can't make a computer. 1,000,000 zeros can't make a computer. And one error that we're going to run into when we're trying to understand the creation of conscious fields by making analogies to things in the physical world, like computers. I make the analogies myself. But we're dealing with something fundamental. When we're dealing with a computer, we're dealing with something contingent, operating in something contingent. So somewhere the analogy is going to break down in a way that we're not quite sure. And also analogies can't be used to prove things, but they can be used as raw material to try to understand things. Totally relevant to bring. You asked if cats can be conscious? Are cats conscious or ants conscious? Anything that's conscious is a being who's attached to a conscious field, like something that has the quality of being able to experience a conscious field is what's conscious, period. If it was possible, I don't know whether it is or isn't, as far as I can tell, part of what you need as part of that whole system of a being in a conscious field is something akin to a mind in order to help connect one to the next, right? But anyhow, really that's almost, the mind stuff is almost besides the point. The cat, when you look at your cat, what isn't conscious, right? Like your visual image. Then you say, was the thing outside there? No, a being you don't see. A being is what's conscious. The body and or mind that's attached to the whole system is not conscious anyway. So my body is not conscious. My brain is not conscious. My mind is not, right? Now, as a separate question, is a cat body and brain attached to a conscious being plus a consciousness field? I don't know. I would guess not, based on different reasoning having to do with free will and related things to that. But I don't know. Right. But I know that the cat body is not conscious and the cat's brain is not conscious, just like my brain and body. If something is conscious, it's a being and it's conscious of a consciousness field and it's attached currently to the body and brain of a cat. So that's my answer to that. So we don't need to know about the universe. I'll wrap this up in a moment. Or actually I can bring you on if you wanted to discuss it for a little while, then we'll call it for time at some point and get to your other question or another question about, I'll check maybe also obviously for questions about the yes frame. By the way, I'm using the yes frame as we speak, talking to David, and he's using it with me too, in the sense that we're both treating this as if there's potentially an answer here. I'm not assuming that he will see the answer that I have in mind for him. He's not assuming he will either. Right? So again, you're not assuming that the person you're selling to is going to say yes, by analogy. But we're both acting on the idea that it's plausible, right? And so we're trying to look and see what categories or distinctions we need to make in order to get, right? So we're illustrating it by doing that. Let me just address this before you on. Let's see here. So we don't need to know about the universe. What we need to know is that something conscious has to be involved in the reason why our consciousness field is the way it is. And that's where we can make a new distinction of cause. There has to be something that is, in essence, aware of what our conscious field is going to be, and then it makes it. So it has to be able to make it, has to be aware of consciousness fields. So it has to be conscious, able to make consciousness fields, and so forth. It's not relevant whether the universe is conscious any more than it's relevant whether Santa Claus or a cat or even you or me is conscious, in a sense, to what I'm saying. I'm identifying qualities that have to be existent in some thing. And that's true regardless of what statements we make about the universe. We could separately explain or understand or tease apart the question of, is the universe as a whole conscious, right? My answer might be similar to saying that a brain is not conscious, right? But it's related and can theoretically be helpful in helping get someone to see it, but it's not intrinsically necessary to answer that question in order to figure out qualities that God has to have. Now, there's a separate proof that God isn't anything that changes, because anything that changes no longer exists. Nothing actually can change. On the other hand, we seem to observe change, so there has to be something to observe about change. There has to be something to understand about change that can exist, but it would have to be within some sort of box or frame or boundary, right? So there have to be some aspect of things or set of things about that exist that don't change. And those are actual things that we can identify. And then there could be, and if they could somehow form things metaphorical to a TV set where what's on the TV set could change, whereas the TV set itself, in one sense, doesn't change. Of course, you can quibble with that and say, actually, the molecules do change. And of course, my analogy breaks down at that point. But there's a way to get what I'm saying about frames or something that doesn't change that can frame something that within it might change. But all that could be very relevant and fundamental to understanding how the world works, right? Is understanding the nature of how and what can change and how and what can't. But if we're talking about something like you or me, we're constantly implying that we don't change by using the same word, the same idea, right? There's a continuity between you previously and you now and you in the future. Same thing with God. So if the universe does change in any way, shape, or form, then it is not in and of itself God. It would have to exist within some frame in some way, shape, or form. that we would want to understand better or could understand better, or that I could explain better and so forth. Anyway, that starts to explain about the universe being conscious. It's certainly related, but not relevant to, as I said, I already said it. So. Mahai says, "You're enjoying this, by the way. Thanks for going into so much detail. You're very welcome. It's sometimes you have to do that. Detail is relevant. And yeah, I'll read Mahai's and I'll get to David. Mahai says, why does God need to be aware of our consciousness field? Can't he just be aware of the code with which we as conscious beings interface? Why does that have to be the case? He's also aware of our individual conscious field itself. Maybe I could work on that better. There's a way that I don't know, feel, understand where the opposite, I'm going to use language that might seem odd, just so inherently contradictory, but I feel like I can grasp how it's absurd to say God's not aware of our conscious field and yet God's creating it. How do you, like, someone who's not aware of it, maybe something like God would have to be conscious in general, right? God would have to have a certain understanding, like a very more than a little understanding of conscious field in the first place, right? If we imagine God having no consciousness, which I don't think that you're saying, but just as something related to what you're saying, or as a way of addressing, I start to cross things off, right? So if God were not conscious at all, then we get to absurdity where we're having someone create conscious fields who has no sense of what they are, no connection to them. Like I don't get any how we're saying anything if we say that. Then to say that God's aware of code, but not your consciousness field, the basic method that I'd be using to explore this is to start to hone in on it, start to draw out the scenario of how it would work, like what would have to happen, how it would be like for that to be the case, right? And then distinctions might arise. I don't want to use the cop out just that I'm having trouble putting it into words. I acknowledge that might be an indication of a lack of clarity and distinctions that I might be able to gain in the future that would be helpful for myself and other people. So it's a good thing you bring up. I think in terms of priority, it seems so obvious to me that, which is not like an excuse. It's not a hand wave, but I just prioritize other things, right? Like I look at it and say, all right, so God would need to be conscious of my conscious field in order to make it ahead of time and then make it for me. And then what would stop God from being conscious of all things that existed, which is all conscious field, basically. And then the reason behind them. There might be major aspects to all this that I haven't figured out yet. And this is why I want to bring you up to speed to where I'm at. And so you guys might figure some of those things out yourself and let me know. I don't know that we're going to find out this is wrong. I don't think that's where it's going to head. But I do think that we can discover more about the basic nature of all that. So my answer for the moment. I might point out that the priority thing is more than it might seem, right? I could stand on my front step and sit there thinking, do I really know properly that I'm not going to fall into an abyss when I step out into my sidewalk? And yet I don't do that. I prioritize other things, right? There's a way that, in one sense, it might be to lead to an awesome breakthrough. Thinking even more clearly about, does God have to be conscious of this or that? But in another sense, there might be a practical reason why there's other places to look as well that might have more impact. It's hard to say. I would at least want to take a look at where my intuition is coming from about that. So I'll be curious about that. You need to leave anyway, right? At 3:25, which is right about now. Okay, you have to go. Okay. Oh, I think someone mentioned a specific webinar earlier in alchemy. So if you scroll up, there's one where I also went into it. And maybe there might be things that are really helpful and important that I've overlooked, and maybe I'll figure those out soon, and maybe someone else will. Megan said it's very helpful to know there is a distinction, but so once in a while, I try not to do it too often because I don't know how much people would want it, but once in a while, I on purpose get quote unquote in the weeds on something like this or whatever, and including being fine with going into places where I don't have every distinction ready in hand and so forth. In order to, in addition to showing process and method, and it also can remove intimidation, right? You can see where I'm stuck and not think that, okay, I'll be like David will probably figure that out or might know it. And you even more feel empowered to figure things out on your own. And I never mean to be intimidating in a certain sense of, oh, I haven't figured out, just listen. But it can creep in there, presumably. So days like this can help with that. Megan said it's very helpful to know there is a distinction between questions that we can work on answering versus questions that are not necessary to answer to understand how things work and what is necessarily true. Without that distinction, it's easy to ask a question and get stuck or blocked. Yeah, and that's right. Is there a plausible reason why God would end my existence? See you later, David. Thanks for everything. I agree, Peter. I don't see one. Like, that's why I don't see why our existence would end pretty much ever. But I don't feel like I have that perfectly proven either. Again, I tend to agree that I don't see it getting annihilated as a being by God, which would mean that has a bunch of ripple effect. If we stipulate that, which again, I'm acknowledging that I don't actually have that proven, but there's a lot to stand on from there, right? That pretty much everything ultimately would be geared around. That's why I say that survival, like on Earth or on this life, is not foundational. Certainly, given one or the other, I choose survival for myself and other people, including it's worth investing a bunch in typically. But there's something else going on, right? Where God's looking for something different than just us surviving, or else we would just survive on Earth indefinitely. But obviously, we're trying to figure something else out or go somewhere else. Vincent says, really appreciate you mixing up the time this week as well. Oh, you're very welcome there. And great. So Fletch gave something additional for David. Good. Just refresh this just to make sure in case. Okay. Got a lot of our discussions been taking place inside of replies rather than new comments here for the last little bit of a time. All right. Yeah. A lot of replies inside of this one thing, for example. All right. So let me quickly touch on, I guess I said I would, so let me just do it. His other question, just quickly for posterity. I'll try to be quick because I've touched on it before, but he asked, and then I'll take a look at any discussion we want to do specifically about the yes frame and further from that, but I'll try to give a quick, so let me see. Shoot, maybe I'll just wait or do next time here. While I haven't, I partly reading this just before the webinar, so let me try to relate this to the yes frame, if anything, and be quick with it. While I think you presented an interesting argument, it seems to me that your Texas analogy has some logical holes. Please help me understand where I'm seeing this wrong. Number one, the government, in parentheses, supposedly representing the people, has passed into law that it has the right to levy tax. There's a social contract that says we're allowing government to collect taxes to provide service. Therefore, it doesn't seem to fall under extortion because there's an implicit agreement between all Americans. So that definitely I would disagree with, as Peter indicated. Right in there, there's at least one or more errors. Number two, David says, the implication of your argument would be that you're arguing for supporting anarchy because the government enforces all laws with guns, and therefore all laws are immoral. I don't know what the right answer is regards to how taxes would be set up to be moral. I'm not sure I agree one way or the other if taxes should be lower or higher. Okay, let me just address this. I'll get this out a little bit briefly. I can at least indicate some answers. I'll go backwards. So number two, no, if there was no, see, the thing with government is that it literally doesn't exist in the first place as something foundational. Maybe it'd be a little bit like, let me work with this analogy for a second, or this parallel, not analogy, for a second. But if we said, how would we recognize who to teach our kids or who we thought was an expert on a topic if it didn't have a PhD system? And then we might say the PhD system is not foundational, right? It got made somewhere by some king or group of people at some university a long time ago. I don't even know the history of it. But obviously it started with just a bunch of people who weren't already PhDs, just having enough social or political power to start it. And then it kept going. So it's not foundational. It's just basically circular, or something like circular. Anyhow, government, the inherent within the idea of government is legitimate government. If you take the implied legitimate out of government, but take the statement, the US government is the government of the American people, that there's an implied legitimate in it, right? If the idea that someone's a member of government means they're a legitimate member of government. The idea that someone's a policeman means they're a legitimate police, right? That the idea of laws is that laws are legitimate laws, right? If you take legitimate out of law or legitimate out of government, it loses all meaning. It unravels immediately, right? So it's not like it may be implied. It's like definitely implied. It's inherent to what they mean. If you say government's not legitimate, you're saying, right, like if I stand in a courtroom and tell the judge they're not legitimate, they can't agree with me because they can't say, sure, I'm not legitimate, but, right? it removes their whole potential foundation. Okay. So of course, government exists in the sense of all sorts of practical implications, right? But it doesn't exist in terms of legitimate, right? What makes the American government legitimate is that a bunch of guys want a revolution against Britain, and therefore they're infallible. Do they have unlimited power and ownership over everyone that future owns, or sorry, lives or was born or whatever in a certain geographical region, right? It all falls apart. Anyway, so my problem with laws is not that they're enforced with guns. My problem with laws is they're inherently not legitimate. They're not foundational. They're just statements of what people that think that they're members of government will do to be violent, if you think of it. And they're vague. And so we don't even know. They're just vague statements about when they're going to be violent, and we don't know when they're actually going to be violent. They're not. We could attempt as bumbling humans who don't know everything, but we still have to try to do stuff. I don't know if my sidewalk's going to hold me up when I step outside, but I still walk on it. Similarly, if someone robs a bank and is hooting and hollering on their carriage away with the gold, and I get up a posse and we shoot them, right? I don't know for sure that wasn't all a mistake, but we try to do our best, especially if killing someone, we try to be as careful as we can, presumably. But anyhow, the point is that whether or not there's government, individuals could still use guns to protect their property. So it's not the guns that I have an issue with. It's pointing out not a political view. As a matter of fact, the whole idea of politics, once again, it only exists as a way to shut people up and marginalize, but marginalize. People say, don't talk about politics, or that's just politics, or why would you want to kill someone just because you disagree with politics? Then it's a way to marginalize and really obfuscate the issue. We don't need the word politics. If someone wants to rape my family and light them on fire, and they label that as a political view, and therefore exclude me from being able to violently disagree with them, I can only vote against what they're doing. That would be ridiculous, right? So the only thing calling that politics would do is try to intimidate me or marginalize me or reduce my options like you do with a child, which doesn't work with for whatever reason, from a young age. They say, give them two options, right? So politics is like very similar to a parent trying to give you two options. And when actually there's plenty of options. If they say, do you want to have peas or broccoli? You might stop and think, wait a second, I want a hamburger. Right? If someone says to you when you're in the middle of being raped and having your family burned to the ground, to a crisp, do you want to vote against that person? Or do you also want to, do you want to speak out against that person or vote against? Or do you want to vote in favor of that or against? Those are your two options. But you should never be uncivil, violent, or anything like that to your rapist. Right? So the idea of politics, and this is a kind of a thing I haven't really said before in this way, is nonsense, right? Again, it's purely, again, when someone brings up the word politics, anything where they're trying to marginalize you or reduce your options implicitly, then they're just doing, and if you buy into that, you're just like a kid who's 5 years old believing that you can only have peas or broccoli. Or a person coming up to you and giving you two forms of poison and you can only choose those two. Right? These aren't your parents being trying to help you be healthy. These are people who are violent. So they don't want you to respond with violence and they want to disarm you in addition, right? And so they want you to be civil while they're raping, or in this case, extorting you, right? If you go against their laws, will they be civil? No. Or they'll be civil like a rapist might be civil, where they're like, I'm trying to be nice here. Why don't you just cooperate, right? And get raped, right? So they won't be civil. They will violently handcuff you, put you in a cell, shoot you if you try to escape, treat you in a subhuman way, lock you up with people who really may well rape you and statistically often do, etc. So that's not civil in my book. It has nothing to do with any random word that marginalizes it or reduces my options to voting, right? That when someone is taking massive amounts of my property, threatening me with death and imprisonment, then I think that certainly killing them in response is a completely reasonable option that should be on the table, right? That's like saying the sky is blue, right? There's thousands and thousands of movies depicting exactly that. It's completely normal. And people violate and they're responded to through being defended against by literally killing them in movie after movie and in real life in plenty of ways that we support, right? So it's not radical or odd to say that if someone's going to kill you, burn your family, rape, take half your property, take all your property, enslave you, etc., right? To respond where killing is certainly on the table. Right? And of course, so that's why I think, of course, killing should be on the table regarding things like that's related to what you said in number two. Number one, obviously, there's no contract between us and government people. Obviously, to agree to a contract, there has to be an exchange of value, has to be voluntary, practically speaking, between adults, right? Children are a difficult gray area with various things regarding coercion. Certainly, I like to err on the side of not coercing children in various ways, but obviously, like if you had a 2-year-old sign a contract for life, that would be ridiculous, right? So there should be an exchange of value, should be this, that, and the other thing, and so forth. There's nothing like that whatsoever with this alleged social contract, right? So it doesn't, the government of the United States does not represent me in any way, shape, or form. I do not use the language even that in any way identifies with the U.S. government. I view them as fully other. There's no difference between them and the aliens in Independence Day to me, for example, including the triumph when one of them gets killed, like when Will Smith killed the alien in Independence Day, the first movie. We all cheer. And there's no difference, right? They both invade, they both kill, they both act as if their property is our property. In neither case am I part of their group in any way, shape, or form. In neither case do I think they have my interests at heart in any way, shape, or form. With the government's in debt, I don't look at it as me being in debt. If the government, I read a headline the other day, oh, Mueller might make us a profit by extorting Paul Manafort and getting more money than all the money they get lined their pockets with their investigation. No, he's not making me a profit by extorting Paul Manafort and lining his own pockets or other people's pockets in government. If I were to suggest that not see how easy it is, but I'd pay attention. I caught myself within a split second. But if the U.S. military were to loot and pillage, if I were to suggest that the U.S. military were to loot and pillage Canada in order to pay for itself, people would be shocked. But one of the things we can do with mental alchemy is play a little game where we notice that the differences between one thing and another thing are purely trivial differences. So what are the differences between the U.S. standing army, military, looting and pillaging Canada to pay for, and Canadians to pay for itself, versus the way they're paid now? The differences are actually trivial as far as I can tell. Right? They're instead paid with money they know is extorted from subjects of the U.S. government. Right? If the subjects don't pay the extortion money, they get put in jail, killed, etc., separated from their children, of course. Right? So everyone in the U.S. standing army knows that U.S. subjects will be separated from their children if they don't cough up money that gets stuck in their pockets. How is that different than looting? If you stand there supporting people extorting people and handing money, is there a difference if instead of looting, the U.S. military marched up to Canada with police, American police? They all went up together. And the U.S. military members sat there with their guns, standing still, watching, as with their moral support, the U.S. police and federal agents went and took money from Canadians and just took gold, money, whatever, and handed it to the standing army to pay the mercenaries. Is there any difference other than the trivial? Is there any relevant, important difference between them doing that and doing the exact same thing to American subjects? And the only other difference would be the standing army protects the subjects of the United States, and it doesn't protect Canadian citizens. Again, that's trivial for at least two reasons. One is the contract thing. If someone allegedly protects me, but I don't have a contract with them, then they don't get to charge me money for it. Just like if they fix my plumbing and I didn't ask them to, or if they fix my roof or whatever they do, they shine my shoes, do my windshield of my car, right? It doesn't mean that they can now take money from me or force me to pay money. So the fact that they're supposedly performing a service that I didn't ask for is obviously irrelevant. And that just the simplest check, right, would see that. And what's the other? I said, oh, and also the U.S. military, in any way that they are protecting U.S. subjects, they're protecting Canadian subjects in the same way. It's basically trivial, the difference, right? You go to Afghanistan and Iraq or whatever, suppose that that's being done successfully and usefully, then that protects. then to the extent it protects the rest of us, it protects Canadian citizens just as much. So again, the differences end up being trivial as far as all right, that's enough of addressing that. Okay, do we have any questions or discussion we want to do or examples of applying the yes frame stuff from this past week? Thanks for starting these conversations today. You're welcome. Yeah, a number of conversation starters today rather than conclusions, although I addressed the yes frame for a while in the very beginning. Did I miss any? I don't think I missed any particular questions about. We're mostly in the discussion with David. Yeah. Okay. Yeah. Okay. By the way, distinctions are not the same as inclusion. I wasn't concluding anything about the people in the U.S. Standing Army or whatever, but just pointing out distinctions and also the triviality of certain seeming distinctions. And those distinctions are real and clear, or they can be potentially argued with. But that doesn't mean that I was making any conclusions. We don't want to conflate the two. Dudley said something here. Let me make sure I don't ignore it. It seems like there is an idea that there is two or more consciousness but that doesn't seem to be the case. It's a bit like the wave is not the ocean, but is still water. Oh, are you talking about like different people and how maybe or with God and perhaps we're like drops of water in an ocean? There's a definite individuality to each of us that we don't want to conflate with the Hindu idea or something where are we all part of the same shared consciousness? No, I'm not aware of your consciousness, right? For sure. So I'm definitely not God. Am I one with God in one sense? Perhaps we could come up with ways that I am, but there's non-trivial ways that I'm not. Again, I can't conscious fields. I'm not aware of everything. I'm not omniscient, not omnipotent. So I'm certainly distinct from God in ways that are not trivial. It's not trivial to not, I know it's double negative, but to not be omniscient, not be omnipotent. So just because we can find a connection somewhere, like just because we can make a picture work, oh, it drops the notion. Can't we all be part of the same consciousness? It's a little bit like the social contract thing. It doesn't stand up to proper editing, proper looking at it to see if it could be wrong, right? Like with the social contract, all you have to do is ask yourself, oh, that reminds me, I have something on my slide actually, not about Texas, but about this. Yes. But with a social contract, it just gives an example of how to check over an idea. And it shows when someone either doesn't know how or hasn't given a serious attempt at checking an idea. If we just check for the first, like obvious stuff, like what do I know that's major and big about contract, right? And we immediately spot stuff like voluntary involves an exchange of value, right? I don't even think that even like having an extreme nature to it, I sign over all my property and myself as a slave to you for the rest of my life. That probably wouldn't be recognized by people, right? Rightly or wrongly, but we have a sense that would that really be a valid contract to do something that extreme? And at least we'd look for if there was some sense of a commensurate exchange of value. If it was for a bowl of soup or something, we would. So when you check over something, at least start checking the big obvious stuff and seeing if it matches up, right? And then it pretty quickly doesn't. So are we all one? Some big obvious stuff. Am I aware of what you're aware of? No, there's a good start, right? That we're not all one. Of course, I say something very important that functionally speaking, there's a way that we are too, right? If God's aware of all of our conscious field and God therefore feels what we feel, then any badness that another person experiences will hurt God and any goodness will be nice for God. And therefore we're all connected and all people, even if they seem to be our enemy, we want to see ideas more as our enemy. Like when I talk about Democrat is an idea, right? It's not intrinsic within people any more than being poor. That's a little bit different, but being poor is a temporary state, right? It might coincidentally end up being permanent in practice during the course of someone's life, but to think of someone as intrinsically poor is ridiculous, right? We currently have a certain amount of money, a certain amount of income. Dividing people into poor people in a kind of a permanent sense is a bad mental tool, and it leads to a lot of wrong conclusions that are coincidentally used by Democrats to end up with more evil, dividing people into classes or treating people as if they're intrinsically poor, and therefore it doesn't matter if we have policies that make them even more poor. And so what was I saying here? So ideas can quote unquote be our enemies, right? People are a complex mixture, right? If there's an emergency, you might need to be violent towards someone to defend yourself. But ideally, we want to get rid of the ideas and not the people, right? We want the people to be happy and healthy and cured of bad ideas, including ourselves, starting with ourselves. Matt says distinguishing real and arbitrary is so critical to understand. To get to that, I may not in terms of any more comments, but I agree. Great. Which means, by the way, all you need to do is distinguish arbitrary. So if you just can, and spotting arbitrary is, at least in my opinion, somewhere between opinion and clarity, I can make the statement that it's fairly easy to spot arbitrary. Instead of trying to spot real, you just spot arbitrary. And then, anyway, more realistic altogether. Maybe now that I think about it, you can spot some real things pretty well too. Anyway, Michael says, how can you apply the yes frame to go from being in a state of no action, deciding to take action? Can you use an SEO agency as an example of deciding what clients to go after? Okay, that's a good question. Let me give my little statement I have on my slide. Good. All right. So in terms of finding the yes frame and also reminding ourselves of the original question that Faith had about, what if you're talking to an investment person, an investor? It seems like there's so much failure rate. Why would they want to say yes to investing in a startup and so forth? Then I wanted to give you this. So in a case of trying to affect someone's behavior, which includes sales and includes motivating them, and includes helping them believe in themselves, I said, you can ask yourself, under what circumstances would this person want to say yes? Right? That's not the only thing to ask, but it gives you a starting point you can think about. It starts getting you to think about that in categories, right? So it jumps straight to the category thing, but that's not necessarily wrong, because if I think, under what circumstances would this girl say yes to a relationship or whatever, what circumstances would this investor say yes? What circumstances would this potential SEO client say yes? Then my answer is going to start to take the form of if they trusted me, if they needed leads, and so forth. Categories. Oh, Fletch had something good to say, by the way, about what's relevant, what's helpful in his experience with SEO clients. If you look in the thread from the previous week in OMG, or with the investor, right? Under what circumstances would they want to say yes? That kind of gets you starting to feel the yes frame, because you have to stand. It forces you to stand on the yes frame. You might say, how do you stand there without seeing it? I don't know, it seems to work out, right? Part of what gets us moving to a certain platform mentally is you start to act on it, believe in it, right? It can be one way to get there. Ultimately, you still want to get distinctions about it, right? And understand it, not just approximate, like end with approximation, but anything that can stimulate you to help you to see it. It's good. So under what circumstances would they want to say yes? Now the rest might flow from there pretty well. Another way to put what I'm saying is, this question might give you a place to stand where their yes frame is now in your box. You can see it from standing by asking, under what circumstances would this person want to say it? Now, not everything with the yes frame involves convincing people or motivating people or dealing with people. And when I say dealing with people, there's also yourself, remember, your own brain. But other times it has to do with answering a question or solving a problem. And you want to be coming from a frame where the problem has a solution, the question has an answer, and then going at it from there. And so you could ask, what would the question or problem or the situation look like if the question problem was answered or solved? Kind of simple, but this might give you an action step that in practice will unblock you or help you. All right, so now let's take a look. I wouldn't necessarily say, just to quickly address Matt said it. So it's only critical to understand arbitrary is real it's only critical to understand arbitrary is because real is the opposite. I wouldn't necessarily say that. They're both very helpful. Arbitrary is particularly helpful at dissolving BS, like the thing with the government, the thing with if you're a kid, if you needed to get past the two options. And then with your own brain, especially, your brain is constantly putting you in a box, right, with options. And when making you feel like something should be true. And once you realize where that's coming from and where it's coming from is arbitrary, then you dissolve the power of it. Same, I do that with government. When you realize that government is arbitrary, when you realize that PhDs are arbitrary, then they don't intimidate you intellectually. All right. So Michael said, how can you apply the yes frame to go from being in a state of, I read this, but I'm just reorienting. How can you apply the yes frame to go from being in a state of no action to decide to take action on a particular course of action? So we want to talk about taking action regarding an SEO agency as an example and what kind of clients to go after. One of the reasons I gave the thing with the frat boy idea or dating or if you're a hetero guy, getting a girl to either date you or sleep with you is I like to have these go-to simple, easy to feel, easy to picture analogies. Now that one might not work for one, including plenty of guys, it just might not work for in terms of feeling it, seeing it quickly and easily. But for a lot, it might, or maybe for all of them, I don't know. It might, maybe for everyone, it's very easy to picture and feel. Because of that, it tends to be good to ground yourself in that. And then once you're grounded there, you skip over and look for how that applies. You're not even looking, it's different than thinking by analogy, what I'm talking about. It's related and doesn't, but it also has to do with getting, kind of helping establish a frame, right? So when I think, and just to try that out here for a moment, and I'm going over the SEO agency, but I'm using this as a stepping stone. So if I imagine, again, there's no value judgments or should statements here. I'm just doing it to picture something because it's easy to feel and picture. So if I'm a guy and I don't have a particular girl in mind, I'm not out, I'm in my home and I'm thinking, when do I take action? How do I take action? To whom do I take action in terms of communicating with, in terms of girls to get someone to validate me, date me, sleep with me, whatever, get a girl to be with me. And then we might think, and what kind of girl to go after. But then we might realize part of what this might do is help us to see a potential flaw or a way to adjust the assumptions of the question itself. We might not need to decide what kind of clients to go after. We might just have a sense of what a yes would look like, including the categories clicking into place and then the person saying yes. And then we just go communicate in that way. We might not be able to narrow down the field ahead of time. We might just figure out how it would go, what the path is to a yes, deal with everyone that way. And it shouldn't, of course, look like pushing them or shaming them or whatever it might be, or looking desperate. But whatever a good path to a yes is from someone who potentially could say yes, that's also reasonably efficient for you, might be all we need to do. That said, of course, there might be several things we could possibly, as a secondary type of efficiency, figure out in terms of narrowing things down. But maybe we don't want to start by narrowing down what clients to go after. Maybe we might, it's premature for that. Maybe we might artificially constrain ourselves from people that might be very helpful. Maybe we heard someone say, stay away from startups, and that got lodged in our mind. But on the other hand, I remember Jamie Washington getting started that way. I remember her asking a question saying, I know you've said startups aren't good, or you yourself exclude startups to one of her coaches. But she said, that's what's coming to me. And she ended up being wildly successful. Probably much more successful than the person who suggested that. That's an example of we don't want to artificially exclude groups of people ahead of time just by assuming. On the other hand, you might discover that certain places or times or groups of prospects are more efficient than others. But again, you might discover that by starting by figuring out the categories and stuff with the yes first. In terms of how do you decide to take action? And again, there's a great post from Fletch up here. Not sure if I'll come across it right off the bat here. But I think it was might have been a reply too. But he was giving some good specifics in terms of what he's seen works with an agency. Yeah, here. He said, he was speaking, of course, to me, your illustration scenario with SEO, link building and Facebook ads and YouTube is absolutely lined up with what I have found business owners want. That vision is very much in play. And when we work with my agency work. And then Megan commented and so forth. So there's this in the last week's that gives additional specifics with an agency. So again, when would you take action and what would be the dividing line? One thing I wrote here that I'll maybe qualify again. I say finding and feeling the yes frame before you start. There's a way to both misinterpret that or that I could be legitimately blamed for implying with what I said. I don't really mean before you take action. You know how I say win, then attack? I don't really mean by that sit around and do nothing until you're sure that your next few actions are going to finish the job. I more mean it's a bit of a tongue-in-cheek way of saying you basically always do the win part. Like I say, win, then attack for attack in a sense, or what might look like an attack would be, I just do a few actions and then I get what I want. But I haven't sat around doing nothing before that. I've been doing the same. In a lot of cases, I might have been doing the same gross actions, the same overall. If someone was just filming me and looking at me, it might have been looking like the same type of person who was struggling. But internally, my framing was I was always gaining understanding, gaining framework, I was focusing on getting the right frame rather than fighting or struggling or whatever. If you were to watch me with my son, I was noticing this the other day. I don't get caught up in details. And if I find myself in a position where I would want to get in an argument with him, which I could see coming prior to it happening by saying, no, wait, we're not doing that, or you can't do that, then in many cases, I won't hop into the argument. I'll basically just let him do what it was he wanted, unless it's particularly important not to. And I'll realize that because in the future, I want it to not get to that point by having the frame set better and more clear and more strongly. There's plenty of times, by the way, that the frame is set well, and I do say, no, you can't do such and such, or mostly I can't, I'm not, I don't know that I ever tell them you can't do such and such, only in major, like kind of circumstances where it would be obviously dangerous. I don't really end up having to put things in that way. It's mainly, I won't do such and such. There's plenty of times when I'll say that, but it won't really cause much of a pushback because the frame's, if I'm seeing it's causing a bunch of pushback, or it's pretty obvious it will, then I mostly focus on thinking about understanding and in the future setting the frame right, rather than getting caught up in a argument in the moment. And also the argument itself can distract, and can and does. I'm talking missing frames here, not kids, right? In case you're not missing, I don't want you to miss my point here. But it's pretty profound because in practice, it changes my response from what most everyone else would do day after day. So it's very practically different path. By not getting caught up in the argument or the fight, including then feeling satisfied, and that this will relate to the taking action at SEO agency directly in a moment. It already does relate, but I'll make sure it's clear. That sense of being filled up and satisfied that, okay, I fought for him not to eat the wrong food, or I drew the line, right? You don't draw the line by drawing it what amounts to arbitrary. If you're in a fight, you really haven't drawn the line very well. Just because you won the fight doesn't mean, ultimately, doesn't mean that night, that day, doesn't mean that you helped draw the line. People think slippery slope. I actually think what in practice amounts to the opposite. If I see something progressing in the way I don't like, instead of pouncing on it to stop it from going a little bit in that direction, because, oh my gosh, that's a slippery slope, it's going to mean it's going to do that more and more. I actually look in the I don't know if opposite's the perfect word, but what's similar to the opposite place, I look at the frame instead of pouncing on the detail or the seeming start to it slipping down a slippery slope. Because if you go after, if we imagine a literal slippery slope, like a snowball about to go down a slope and keep going. If absolutely necessary, of course, I'll stop the snowball, or it's simple. I'm not saying I'll just let something roll down a hill that I could just easily stop. But there's a way that in practice, the way that actually works with people or with my son or whatever, like just hopping into a fight over a particular boundary, again, it'll not only is it counterproductive in other ways, but it'll keep me or my wife, if she does it, from thinking and seeing how to get the boundary right in the future ahead of time. Okay. So let me relate that to the SEO thing. So first of all, we don't have to think about when to take action. We think about where to stand, and then you will want to take action plenty. If you don't want to take action, this is a little bit what I'm talking about. You don't have to force yourself to take action necessarily. You work on the frame. Now, if you force yourself to take action in order to work on the frame, and that's effective in some way, you have to look at the situation, right? There might be times when risking somewhat of an argument with my son or a fight is necessary because it's part of reinforcing a frame. I know this is going to sound very similar to what I said you don't do with the slippery slope. So try to look for how to make the distinction clear. It's going to relate to distinctions, right? Distinctions lead to clarity. Clarity leads to strength, and strength is going to be in a frame, not in a moment or a detail or a struggle. So if I'm going to not do something my son wants to do, as I do it, I'm reinforcing a distinction, not something arbitrary. It'll be part of helping him see an existing thing that's real for whatever that reason might be. Like here's maybe an example. He had ice cream, which is okay. Like we have this frozen yogurt that I get that's vanilla, and it's a pretty good, satisfying thing to eat that is basically no worse than most anything else he could eat even for dinner. We also give him dinner, but there's a way that really makes him happy and satisfied with 2 scoops of it, 2 separate cones of one little. And we spend time together. He likes to watch me play a computer game that he likes while I do it often, and that's very satisfying. And then he's much easier to deal with after. So he does that. So he did that one day, and then he said, "Let's go to Barnes and Noble," and he wanted to get a cupcake. I said, "There's no way you're getting a cupcake right after having your ice cream." But there was trying this as I speak to see if there's a way to see that. But it wasn't like I was worried about a slippery slope. I was helping him see a distinction, like and we related the illustration we give to him so he can in kind of clear and useful ways with his gut bacteria, believe it or not, where there's bad bacteria and good bacteria, and they get fed, but peas feed good bacteria and the cupcake, whatever, would feed bad bacteria, which is approximately, it's not false. It's just a dramatic way to dramatize it and illustrate it. But I use it to help reinforce that way of looking at it in distinction. I was like, if we do that, it'll overwhelm. It's way too much food for bad bacteria. It'll overwhelm. So I'm saying, so I wasn't worried about a slippery slope. I wasn't worried about him getting in a habit. I was reinforcing a distinction. And there was a bit of pushback, but not much, right? Because it was focused on a distinction. It was focused on a frame that was already there, and it was already correct and good and real and not arbitrary and so forth. Now, at some point, you're eyeballing it. I don't know exactly when, he's going to get sick or put himself on the road to getting sick. But because of that, it's a reasonable eyeball, obviously, to not have a cupcake after having ice cream and before having any more dinner, right? So it's such an obvious, easy eyeball that it was, and then relating to a distinction, not just like I didn't say, if you have, what I absolutely didn't say, and this is an illustration of what would be a slippery slope way to do it. It's wrong or to struggle. If you have a cupcake today, you're going to ask for 2 cupcakes tomorrow, and then you're going to eat worse tomorrow. I don't say that. You see what I'm saying? It's related to a distinction now, something that happens now, not if you do this, you're going to be worse tomorrow. Because first of all, that just programs him to be worse, right? You're actually future pacing him to do the wrong thing. Look, if you do something bad now, you're going to do it even worse tomorrow. What kind of message is that? That's literally future pacing, right? It's like giving him a powerful sales technique to be worse, right? That badly, anyway, that we have to struggle to keep from making it worse, but instead it relates to a distinction. I don't know how fully clear that is, but it gives you something to work with. All right. So with the taking action, again, I was saying you don't need to take action in order, if you don't look for understanding. Understanding could be what to do. It can be understanding of specific prospects. If you go out and network and have conversations, you might understand a particular person better. Now, if you do that several times and you feel like I'm not understanding overall how to make the sale better, then you might try a different angle to increase your, or you might try to use the raw material you have better. But that might, again, involve some thinking. Maybe you take a walk and you go back over your conversation you have with people and think what it implies. What they said on the surface meeting of what a prospect said might not be the same as if you think about what are the reasons they might have had for saying that. And one way you do that is you think, well, if I said that, this might not be the only thing, but if I said that, why might I say so? It wouldn't just necessarily be the surface meeting. If I say, let me ask my partner and I'll call you later, I might be doing that to put the person off, the salesperson off, right? Not to, because I really mean that. But then why would I mean that? That might be one belief to service, but then ask, why would I put them off? Maybe I definitely don't want their product or service. But then again, maybe I might, maybe I need to finish some projects of my own, or maybe I need to feel more financially confident before I order another service or whatever. Think about what you might mean. Then try to think about try to think of another person that you create in your head, either an archetype or an actual person, and what might they mean? In many cases, it might be the same answer as what you mean. But by getting outside of your head, by creating an archetype or thinking of an actual person, then you can perhaps notice some other distinctions about what a person might mean by what they said when you talk, in order to get to know them better to be a client or whatever. So in terms of taking action, you can think of it like you're always taking action. And it's really a question of getting a sense of what action has most impact, which is where there's a circular positive feedback loop between seeking understanding. Therefore, what are you trying to understand fundamentally? You're trying to understand what has the most impact. All kinds of context, raw material, networking interactions, thinking, planning, scheduling, all of it can help you to understand what actions are going to have the most impact. Or if you try to rank a website and you rank it, then you have a good sense of what actions have an impact on ranking the website, right? If you then have that ranked website and you talk to the potential client and they don't just say yes based on that, I'm not saying that's the case, they may. But if they don't, then you realize that at least in and of itself, that doesn't have enough impact. And so you don't just keep doing nothing but ranking sites in that case. Instead, you try to look for other categories you need to have in your favor, right? However, having sites ranked ticks off one potential category that'll help you to see how important that category is. So it can be very helpful and relevant to get that taken care of, right? But all of it should be in service of what serves the goal of understanding better and better what's important, what has the impact. That's literally all you have to do fundamentally. Everything flows from gaining understanding of what has impact. Everything. All the other actions and details and decisions are going to be what amounts to common sense, including intermediate stuff like mindset, perseverance, determination, focus, not just sitting planning all the time. All of that's common sense. And you could just eyeball it or do the best you can, but you're going to figure all that stuff out if you fundamentally make everything about gaining more and more understanding, distinctions, and so forth about framework, right? Context, raw material that you use. Raw material, again, is things like you talk to a potential prospect, they respond to you, then you have raw material than you previously had, right? You sit down with a notebook and you ask some questions and you write them down. You have potentially raw material than you previously had, right? Anyway, so that is my answer to that. May not be perfect, but it's my Faith said, I came on at the end, but was literally writing. Michael said, thank you, David. I need to raise my understanding on creating and setting frame. Sure thing. You're in the right place to do it. And I might I might think of more specifics, but I've given a bunch of different specifics over this webinar and others about SEO stuff, like selling it and so forth. You can draw on that. Faith said, I came on at the end, but was literally writing this before I jumped on. It's like taxes. When people say you can just leave the country if you don't want to pay taxes, maybe they can't leave the country. Maybe they can't get a passport. Maybe their parents are sick and they're caring. And you're talking about with the issue with women, right? Women did not consciously knowing and willingly agree to this female discount. There's no social contract. So again, Faith's main point here that she's coming to is she was making an analogy to the point she was going to make about taxes, but she's actually talking about issues relating to women inequality. Okay, which is an interesting topic. So she says, women did not consciously, knowingly, and willingly agree to this female discount. There is no social contract. They're not willingly agreeing to be paid less than men. They don't see a way out. It is soft coercion. Now, I'm going to certainly keep reading it, and I don't know everything about this whatsoever, and I'm open to discussing as very much an equal about this. So anything I say regarding this topic, I don't want to be taken as like David coming from on high as the LOI expert or anything like that. I'm just talking and thinking. One thing that I noticed, though, as I read that is that if a woman or any person agrees to an employment contract or an outsourcing contract or any sort of joint venture contract, then they are in fact agreeing to that contract, right? Like I myself, if I agree to a contract with my partners on how much percentage I get, then we could say that I didn't agree to how much some other person makes relative to me, but not even in my partners. I didn't agree how much Jennifer Lawrence gets paid on something, and it might be more than I'm going to get paid as a partner at OMG. But again, I think there's a number of related points that you're making that are going to be very important and valid. But in and of itself, saying that if a woman or any person agrees to a contract, they did in fact agree to that contract. If a man is being paid more, that wouldn't make the contract invalid. Anyway, those are just points. Remember, when I make distinctions, like any of us, if any of us make distinctions, they're very critical. We have a habit that's going to be very ingrained in us socially and whatever we call it, to conflate a distinction with a conclusion, right? So I'm not making any conclusion right now. I'm just making a distinction, which is very different. And I'm not in any way against women's equality things as a whole, as a whatever. Okay, let's go on. Quote, if you don't like being harassed at work, find another job. Absolutely. I agree that if harassment is not part of your contract, right, then that, and really there's more than one issue here, right? Being harassed is to be wronged, presumably, depending on, as long as we draw the line of harassment in a reasonable place, right? but it certainly happens in a way that is a violation, plenty, and in a way that I fully would like to see gone, would see here. Anyway, I'll go on for a moment. Quote, the next job will pay less. Oh, there's her answer. The next job will pay less and I may still be harassed at work. I need the money for my survival and that of my children. Quote, then what are you complaining about? Just endure this harassment and be grateful it's not worse. Right. Again, I think to solve this, there's going to be multiple, and I think you agree with this general statement, there's going to be multiple distinctions that are going to need to be made. One of the things that the left does, and I don't mean the right doesn't do it as well, and I'm on neither, although of course I side more with the right in practice. But one thing that I was going to say that's done in the political world is you trying to like bludgeon people. We want to make distinctions, including help other people make distinctions. And again, I say this knowing that they basically agree with what I'm saying, not in a way that I'm disagreeing. But what we overall want to do is help people see distinctions rather than bludgeon them with, like is done now generally. For example, that famous, so to speak, case of the 21-year-old girl that was working at a pizza shop in Indiana, and the media people on the left went and shopped around and finally found someone who wouldn't agree to bake a cake for a gay wedding. Right? Do I disagree with not baking a cake for a gay wedding? I do disagree. Certainly think that people who are gay, lesbian, and such should be treated fully equally, including morally and so on. 100%. There's absolutely zero wrong in every way, shape, and form with that, with being gay or lesbian. However, instead of looking to help people see distinction, instead it was bludgeoning this poor 21-year-old girl, making her out into being evil, trying to act like everyone agrees with her when she's that everyone in a particular, that his political opponent disagrees with her. Of course, not everyone, right? They want to make it feel like the majority is against her, and basically politicizing it in a way where we're not making distinctions. We're just being mean and bullying and trying to destroy this girl, trying to destroy all over the place, right? People that disagree and should be out of a job and so on and so forth. Instead, yeah, we want distinctions. With the Me Too movement, the idea is we want to destroy every man who crosses the line. I don't mean Faith's idea. Obviously, there's an idea about that. The trouble with that, and I point this out with racism, if you're caught and therefore must be destroyed, then of course you need to not examine your frame, because if you're wrong for having a certain frame and wrong to the extent that you need to be destroyed for standing in a certain place. So if a man is standing in a place where they're harassing, this is similar to what I talked about survival. When survival is foundational to people, which it shouldn't be, then justice seems like it's useful. Or where it's like plan A is like justice, revenge, right? Economically making it very uneconomical for a person to do a certain behavior, right? That's what the criminal justice system is mainly, or at least a major part of it is about, trying to make it uneconomical for someone to violate, right? More like a criminal economics system. When we look to destroy people for having certain lacks or distinctions, right? And the wrong platforms, wrong frames, then that creates a backlash for us truly winning and getting rid of the ideas, because people can't examine their ideas. They have to be even more defensive, right? Okay. So we help this problem by trying to make distinctions, similar to the issue with racism, right? Faith said this is coercion, not free choice. It's also a false dichotomy. You must be willing to endure violations of your property rights in order to have anything to. There's another property right that's going to help us see all this. Is what we need to do is also take into account, but not exclusively, take into account the property rights of a business owner or someone that's creating jobs, right? So if a person makes a business, they rent a brick and mortar store and they hire employees, then we're going to perhaps get to, also maybe jumping ahead slightly, but the real complaint, there's going to be at least two potential complaints that the woman could have. One is an issue of reliance, and which is a legitimate, but of course it coincides with the law. Plenty of things that are law are also make sense. If I end up talking about something that happens to also correspond with what's legally correct, that's fine. I'm not saying the law is legitimate or not, but individual things that are illegal also make sense, right? Just in and of themselves. So reliance is an example of something that makes sense in and of itself, where if I invest, if someone implies that it pretty clearly that a job just has certain characteristics and I invest in that, and then you violate those characteristics by doing something that is some form of harassment, right? Then we potentially have one thing that we potentially have is a reliant situation, right? You rely on something and invest in it. Another, the more we distinguish the personal property of the various people involved, the more, again, the more we'll see more clearly, the more we can help other people see more clearly, and also get our ideas right ourselves. A job as a whole, if we start trying to just skip over to where a job as a whole is a woman's property, then we're probably making a mistake. We're asserting something that I don't know that we could stick with. Right? How is a job a person's property in an ongoing way? If I'm given a job, how is threatening for me to not have that job next month? How is the job next month necessarily my property? Reliance helps shed light on that issue. However, but it also helps draw a certain line where to say that, oh, I was relying on having that job for the next 5 years. Someone could legitimately say to me, why were you relying on the job? The person didn't offer you a job for that. However, we need to have a sense of that. I'm going to go on with this for a second just to see what kind of details we get, where we go with, and what kinds of useful things might come up, and just to see what useful illustrations of the process of thinking about this stuff might come up. What was the other property right I was saying? Oh, just in terms of certain harassment can cross property rights lines in terms of your physical body, reputation, and such. Obviously, with harassment, you're dealing with something where it's predictably there's going to be in between the black and the white, there's a gray, and then there's black and white on both sides. There's things that are going to be clearly not harassment that people need in order to have any sense of potentially dating or flirting. And then there's things where they're absolutely positively harassment. And then there's a gray area, but presumably once anyone's having this discussion or involved in this, they would want to stay pretty far on the white side of the gray area. I know I would. However, one useful thing to remember about a gray area is it's better to use gray, for lack of a better word. I'm sure there's a better word, but like gray punishment or gray pushback in a gray area. So going straight for total destruction inside of a gray area is unhelpful in every way. Same as like destroying, if this is in the same gender direction again, but like if a guy who's 20 sleeps with a 17-year-old girl and they put him in jail for 20 years, right? There's a certain places that wouldn't be a gray area, right? I don't know, 10-year-old girl and a guy of any age that's not a total kid themselves, then that's not a gray area, right? But 20-year-old guy, 17-year-old girl, presumably a gray area, right? And so you want to have the pushback be gray, meaning relatively mild or moderate or in line with the gray as well, and not some massive thing that occurs sometimes. You have these massive punishments, gray things. Similarly, even with kind of social constructs or kind of things that like potential cultural memes or that we're trying to spread, we don't want massive responses in the gray area that's just going to cause a backlash. And none of this is preaching. This is me just thinking out loud, by the way. The underlying assumption is that a woman is choosing to work, that she could just go get married and have a man to take care of it. Well, yeah, that certainly we would want to assume. That is so false, it's laughable. Women are compelled to work just to survive, just as men do. Right. Absolutely. That statement's correct. I'd be careful about conflating that women need money to survive just like men with that you have to have a job, right? And keep in mind on the left, or I don't know if it's on the left, but on the punishment side of the Me Too movement, they certainly don't act like the violators have a need to make money because they want that person utterly destroyed financially in an overall way. We might say they're a violator, they have no right, or they violated, therefore we can obliterate them in any way, shape, or form. Again, we want to watch it with how gray something is. If something is an extreme violation, then an extreme punishment is one thing that might be reasonable depending on what our premise is as well, of what we're trying to accomplish. Remember, overall, in life, we're trying to, like the reason why killing extortionists is plan B rather than plan A is that overall, it's not about property or surviving. It's about getting to the good place with people. So we want to always keep that in mind. So extreme stopping of people, punishment and justice and so forth is only as a matter of urgency or timeliness, right? Or whatever. And even whatever, like even, anyway, it's a little bit you too many ideas there, but not sure where else to go with this for the moment. I know we've gone about 2.5 hours here too. Most men have no interest or capability to support their wives. By the way, taxes part of that. Two income houses are the norm, and they could right. So certainly, it's absolutely false to make any argument like a woman could get married or get supported by a man. 100%, including having the pay be either when we're talking about harassment or less pay. If the argument had anything to do with she could just get married and have a man take care of her, she should. Clearly, that's right. No question there. There's a difference between refuting or pointing out the one thing is ridiculous, which is a distinction, and a conclusion, right? So we have to be careful of our conclusions and watch out for false dichotomies. You point out yourself, but there could be other false dichotomies. It could be reasonable for an employer to negotiate the cheapest employment contract that he or she could, right? I might also point out that if women really were willing to work for less, then there's at least two additional options for any particular person, right? If you want women to have jobs, similar to what I say about healthcare, if you want everyone to have access to healthcare, then there's a super easy answer to anyone. I'm not speaking to anyone in particular here, just saying overall. There's a super easy answer that I don't know why it doesn't occur to people, which is pay for it, right? If you want a hamburger, what do? Pay for it, right? You want a car, pay for it. You want a Rolls Royce, pay for it. You don't want to pay for it, you don't get it, right? There's on a simple level good things that I would like to have, but I can't pay for it, so I don't have it for myself or for other people, right? That's necessary and normal. So if someone, like I was reading, this guy wants a universal basic income for everyone. Great, so do I. So pay for it. What I don't want to do is extort other people. That's insanely horrible and sick and evil, right? It's not plan A, but it'd be perfectly reasonable to instantly execute someone who advocates for a universal income based on extortion, because they're advocating for extortion in a serious way. But why on earth do these people not think of what's obvious and not evil, which is to pay for it yourself? So if you want everyone to have $1,000 a month in America or everywhere, presumably you want everyone on the planet to have that, right? And not just Americans to make that sense, right? So just pay for it. What's the freaking problem? You say, well, I can't pay for it. Well, then find a way to pay for it. Why is this so complicated? You don't know how to pay for it, then work on a framework if that's what you want, right? If that's a priority or you think, and if it's not a priority, then work on the priority, right? Either that's a priority. Think about it. Either it's a priority for everyone to get $1,000 a month, in which case you work on it until you achieve it, or there's a different priority, in which case there's by definition, by logic, a different priority. So work on that. Why is it complicated? It's so simple, and it's shocking that it's not, that people miss it. Easy breezy. Anyway, when it comes to women and income, there's some easy solutions. First of all, simply provide a job for all women that's at the level that you think it should be. Why would you turn to other people? You could certainly also try to spread memes to pay women, but I don't know what. I run into an issue. I want to solve this too, but we have to get our ideas right to solve it. How do you figure out what to pay a woman? Suppose I was hiring someone and I was trying to figure out what if it was just one employee and they're a woman or a man? How do I figure out what to pay them where do I have to look at some industry standard? What if there's no industry standard? Like it all. And then what if the woman will work for less than the man? Do I voluntarily pay them more? Isn't that charity? You could say, well, it's prudent because if she finds out, she'll be pissed off. That may be right. I might agree. But what if they won't? That's the only reason that she'll agree to a contract and basically violate it by doing a work slowdown because someone else is getting paid more. Something is going on because Hillary Clinton's staff had the same pay disparity as what they say, right? Like 77% or something. Not accusing or saying whataboutism. I'm just saying that presumably she's not like a militant advocate for not paying women as much as they equal. Let's give her the benefit of the doubt, which maybe is a mistake. But let's suppose she actually wants women to be paid the same, whether or not that's true. Then she's still not doing it. She wasn't doing it. So What's going on? Maybe there's other reasons. Anyhow, so if we want women to be paid the same, first thing we can do is give them all jobs and think through how to do that. The other, you just get rich. You just make a company doing as good a job. Let's say you're a woman and you want this, right? If you're a woman, presumably if you are thinking about this issue, typically women think that they can do just as good a job as men, right? I don't dispute that at all. So let's say you think I can do just as good a job as men. So you create a company doing whatever, do just as good a job as the man who created the other company that's already existed. Hire women, pay them 77%, and you'll kill it, right? Because your whole workforce works for less. For the guy that's hiring men and women, he's overpaying the men. So you can easily outcompete him, make more money, or make a killing, right? So if that premise is true, you just go do that. Say, I'm not willing to do it. I want to pay them the same. Okay, then do that, right? Presumably, if you pay women the same, you come out even or ahead, right? If you come out behind, right? If you say this other man who has this company, let's say Apple, let's say he has half men and half women, let's just stipulate, I'm not sure that's the case. I know that some tech companies that, but then, and there's no conclusions here. Again, I might sound like, but I'm just making distinctions or trying out different things, right? So do they have a competitive advantage because they pay women less? If you pay men and women the same? That can't be the case, or else you don't have an argument, right? If it gives a business an advantage to pay women less, then there's a good reason to do it, right? If you say, I can't make a company that can survive if I pay women the same, now you're proving your own or anti-proving, right? Just proving your own premise. So it must be the case that you could pay women the same and either stay even with, or presumably even do better than someone who's paying women less. So go do that. Now, someone could say back, look, I'm not going to make a job for every single woman. So I at least like to spread ideas that will help men see, or men or women, maybe women are hiring women and paying them less too, see what not to do. Or maybe all we're at is a place where we just realize certain things that are definitely incorrect, like you correctly pointed out, about that's so false, it's laughable, that the argument that you just get married. Granted, people might use that argument just like they use the social contract thing, and it's horrendous. Right. Also, the fact that spreading awareness about what could be harassment. Although these days people are perhaps pretty more aware, but at the same time, that's being done with a backlash now, I'm sure. Anyway, those are some random thoughts. You can say you don't have to pay taxes legally. You can spend quite a lot of money and set up a legal business structure to not pay tax. Exactly. But then, of course, that's the same as being taxed. I'm skeptical of this final thing, Faith, where you're saying in law, one of the elements of a valid contract is there's no undue pressure. The need to survive creates the most fundamental pressure of all. But you can invalidate like even a normal work contract by saying, I signed this contract, but I needed to survive. And therefore the contract is not valid. I don't even have to do my part. You see what I'm saying? If you say that there's undue pressure whenever someone needs a job in order to survive, then you can't really have a normal job contract in the first place, regardless. So I'm not sure. I might be missing something, and I don't know how much we can get just on this webinar, but over time, of course, you're fully on board with creating accurate distinctions, change the mental contradictions, not with punishment and destroy. Faith says if I take, and I'll wrap this all up in a second here, but if I take 40% of your income and give it to someone else because they're poorer than you, that's property violation. If I take 20% of the money, there may be other reasons why paying a woman less, and even saying less than a somewhat arbitrary, somewhat non-arbitrary man, right? When I say that, it's a little hard to say apples to apples with jobs and performance and all. But there's not the same thing. It might be wrong for other reasons, but there's somewhere where I think that you're off with part of this. And it doesn't make me right. I'm just discussing this. So again, it's a little bit tough because I'm running the webinar. And if I say someone's off, I'm a little bit coming from a sort of pseudo position of authority, but explicitly disavow that, disaffirm that. Of course, I'm also not, obviously people might not see it that way, but just in case. But anyway, I'm not coming from that position regardless. But anyhow, I don't agree here that if you take you don't take money from someone. If you agree with an employment contract and you pay one person one thing and pay another person another thing, you're not taking money from one person and giving it to another. I don't see how someone else's money they make for doing it. So there's a man sitting at the cubicle next. I'm not saying you sit at a cubicle, but I'm just being whimsical. So there's a woman, and at the cubicle next to her doing the same supposed job is a man, and he's getting paid more. He's getting paid $100 an hour. She's getting paid $60 an hour. And then we're saying that's not the same as taking money from her and or extorting money to pay her. Again, there might be other reasons why it's wrong, but I just don't agree with the analogy. When I say I don't agree, I don't know how to phrase it perfectly, but from where I'm sitting, there's a clear distinction in a way that it's just simply not taking or stealing. Brian says there's a great woman owned and operated company in India that hires women girls off the street to learn the mechanic trade and getting paid the same as local men. Really great. Exactly. And we run into an odd issue here, right? The same thing we run into with Black people in America, where there's a walking back of being colorblind or gender blind or whatever, right? Clearly, in order to fix this issue, I'm not arguing one way or the other, but we want to avoid the equality issue. And we really want to avoid fairness just for its own reasons too. But like the idea, remember the song, like be colorblind, the rest will follow. There's a major pushback to that or backlash. There's all kinds of communications from all sorts of people that say, no, we explicitly disagree. I mean, on the people advocating for Black people saying we disagree with the colorblind because of historical issues. What Brian is pointing to is the same thing. I'm not really affirming one way or the other. What I'm saying is we need to be careful with what we ask for to make sure that it's not going to contradict what we really end up wanting. This woman is being preferential and being unfair in favor of women and girls in order to try to compensate for something and so forth. So what we want to do is, it's a little bit like I see in politics. People start to criticize the tactics of the other side, and then they immediately get accused of being hypocrites. The minute you accuse someone of tactics you don't like, of being too extreme with tactics, then you're screwed, right? Because then you or someone on your side need to use those tactics, or you handcuff yourself by not using the same tactics in response, so I don't do that. I say, let's put everything on the table. Let's put killing our political, so to speak, opposition on the table, because I think the whole idea of politics is just marginalized, right? If someone's going to extort me and kill me if I don't give the money, and separate me from my kids if I don't give the extortion money, and we're talking about half my money, then I want killing the person to defend myself to be on the table for sure. So I think killing your political opposition, if politics includes things that extreme and horrendous, is completely reasonable on the table. So I'm with any and all. So the tactics aren't what I criticize. It's the violation of fundamental property rights. They said what you're talking about works in a vacuum, not in a society that was set up to keep in place a particular hierarchy. We need to reveal the base. Hey, I say it's all arbitrary. I'm not in favor of keeping. Let's see here. We need to reveal the base false contradictions and how they're institutionalized in laws and structures. You're welcome, Brian. Yeah, any sort of revealing base false contradictions is always good. Laws are inherently contradictory, right? They're inherently illegitimate, right? If a law is legitimate, my point is, if a law is legitimate, it's legitimate in and of itself. It's legitimate for a reason other than the fact it's a law. So the fact that something's a law never makes legitimate. Therefore, right now you could say, practically speaking, we want to make laws more in line with what's actually the case. But I thought that through, and of course I agree on one level. But how do you do it? The only way to make laws that coincide with what's correct is you have a way to figure out what's correct in the first place, and other people have a way to figure it. You get in the playing field where people can see what's correct, at which point the law become irrelevant as a stopgap or temporary measure. Perhaps that certainly, just like I want lower taxes as a temporary measure, right? Then of course that's the case. Obviously, if you figure out things you'd rather be the case, then, but usually, I don't know. One thing you want to watch out for is violence. Be very careful about just simply advocating something that's going to end up using violence to solve a problem. The one problem violence can solve in a sort of plan B temporary manner is counteracting violators, but also watch out for that being plan A overall, right? There's very little difference between saying we should make a law against men who harass and saying you should kill all Democrats or all taxers, all Republicans who are taxers and all, right? What's the difference between a taxer and a man who harasses? right? If a gun was to my head, I would say the tax was worse, but they're both very bad. And of course, it would also depend on the degree of taxation, right? 0.01% income tax or some kind of tax would be not as bad as a certain amount of rent, certainly for America. So it's a matter of degree of both. These days, taxation is so high that I don't know, but it doesn't matter. The degree doesn't matter. But it's just careful again. If you when you want to when you want to add more violence to the system, is you want to be careful. When I want less taxes, I'm trying to get violence out of the system. Same thing with regulation, right? How should we represent regulation? Do you guys see a regulator in the same way as a serial child molester or an arsonist or a serial killer? You should, right? Regulation can be applied in a useful way. Anything outside of this is basically a trivial difference. A regulator is somebody who prevents currently poor people from getting food and who prevents currently sick people from getting medicine and relieving their suffering. That's a regulator. They're as evil as any evil can be. So reducing regulation, reducing violence in whatever ways is useful. So just be careful about adding to it. There's a difference between wanting something enshrined in law that's reducing basically the government versus one that's increasing it. They said better. This is something I've been wrestling with. If someone made their money through property violation, then how did that get made up for? It has a helpful hint, and I'm not saying I have it all figured out, but it's not about you don't make up for bad, period. You don't make up for it with bad. You don't make up for it with good. You don't make up for it. Bad creates that. That bad that gets created is bad. It is profound. This will alleviate a lot of questions you guys have even on making money and various things in a bit of a couple of steps way, but it'll give you a platform or a box or frame that'll help you figure things out that might not be obvious otherwise. You don't make up for bad ever, period, including you screw something up in business, you do this, that, the other thing. Forget about making up for it. It's similar to if you're thinking about whether to buy or sell a stock that you own, it's completely irrelevant what price you bought it at. However, psychologically, people tend to think about that. What did I buy it at? But if you think about it logically, practically, et cetera, you should fully ignore what you bought it at and just think whether you would buy it right now at this price, so to speak. Just think whether you want to keep it. So the minute you start asking yourself, how do we cure bad that's already happened? You're going to go down a road where all your answers are going to be wrong because you're standing in a frame that's fundamentally not just flawed, but very basically like flawed. It means you may be right, may be wrong, but like basically all your thoughts are going to be wrong. It's like the whole problem that Democrats have is they start by thinking of extortion as this wonderful tool. And then they think of all the good they can do it. Right. And once you start there, all your thoughts are going to be evil, which is why I'm comfortable saying 100%. Right. It's all evil. So similarly, as soon as you start trying to make up for previous bad or previous property rights violations, you can't do it. You can't fix it. All you can do is find what's good and work towards that. Probably that woman in India would be better off working towards what was good instead of trying to only work with women. I'd have to work through it a little bit, but again, you're just in the wrong place. Then you start to come up with all these things. You start to get bitter and angry and just all kinds of, right? I don't want to make up for taxation that's already happened, right? I'm not advocating to strip the property from anyone whose parents worked for government, right? I could argue for that. If I wanted to try to make up for the evil that's been done, then anyone whose even parents work for government, strip them of everything. Because maybe that was used as seed money to make the rest of the money, et cetera, et cetera. Maybe we could say that's they inherited, the rest was done other stuff. So it's not really about that. We just want to get to a good place, not try to make up for the bad. There is no such thing as making up for the bad. You try to do it, you double down on it. That's the issue with justice. Justice is only going to make things worse. It's like a little bit like credit card spending. If it's urgent, it can be, I don't know, necessary or helpful in one way of looking at it. But if once someone makes a mistake of thinking, oh, this credit card is free money, let's just start using it. That's when they get themselves into trouble. Right. You certainly want to take on the idea behind the problem always. Figure out what frame is leading to these bad decisions and bad ideas and do your best. Jennifer says, in terms of Canada versus US citizens, oh, this is an hour ago, citizens in your tax example, I was considering the other day the difference in public incredulity about one student shooting another in school on the sidewalk at the park, looking at different, in school versus on a sidewalk at a park. Exactly. There's sidewalk shootings by students or kids that age all over the place in Chicago nonstop and so forth. Okay, I really better end things here. I'm going to cut anyone else. Good. Yeah, I got a message that the audio went away and came back, but usually a few minutes. Wow. Okay, that's too bad. Sorry about that. Yeah. Still be careful about something being thought of as universal law, Dudley, just because it applies in all cultures. Oh, sorry. Definitely if something can be otherwise figured out to be universal as a truth, then it applies to everywhere as truth. But you might not be saying this at all, but just because something is in every culture doesn't make it, even if everyone agreed on it. Alrighty. Okay, I really better stop here. Faith gave you a second win by talking about it. So that was interesting for me. Now, I'm not even passionately involved with the topic, but somehow I think it's a template. I think what interests me about race, gender, issues like that are more because it's an interesting template with which to practice thinking. Even taxes in a sense, but it's so universal, right? It's shared between all of us in a certain way. A lot of us might look at it as a secondary issue to like our immediate job or family issues, whatever. But on the other hand, there's a certain kind of, it provides something and it's fun to talk about it in a way that ruthless, but socially acceptable, like where we can practice talking about something we're not supposed to talk about or say things, be able to, whatever, think about things. Anyhow, a different webinar than often where mostly I did give this one thing about a hint about helping define with a yes frame. I dealt with some things there, but mostly we just did some discussion and so forth. But this way I'm also don't feel too behind on doing some discussion with people. And I'll look and see what happens next week, Wednesday. Probably can do Wednesday. Then I'm not sure if I'll take a break from the series for a while. After that, Stephen will be back on with Ascension. We'll see. But I'll look to almost certainly do this coming Wednesday and maybe have some good stuff for us. Maybe I can make it extra practical just to kind of balance things out. But it seems people are pretty into this. We got actually quite good attendance and everyone, people really stayed on for 3 hours. Cool stuff. It is a little bit interesting to see how the tax rates climbed up along with the two-family income thing, where it's no matter what, we sure as hell wouldn't want women to be locked into having to be supported by a husband. That can work out great or it can work out horrible and being locked into it. But it's interesting to note that now we're taxed at like 40% and that makes up for the two-income household. Basically exactly canceled it out. Whereas back when there was no income tax to speak of for people other than passive income when it was first taxed and it wasn't really relevant to working families and all that stuff, then the single family earner was much more reasonable. Ironic. It took me quite a while to dissolve the tax idea at first, Dave says. However, I've come to see clearly that some aspect of it is still the same as zero. Yeah, it was like that for me too. Yeah. But I slowly came around more. And then once you really see it, you're like, well, how did I ever think otherwise? Appreciate that, Ernie. Thanks, David. It's always good. Great. Megan says, really good to go deep and watch the process of clarifying and make distinctions. Yeah, if anything, the removing the intimidation, the more you guys can see me thinking about things out loud, not knowing certain answers and plenty of answers, feeling my way around, the more it empowers you. Ironic sort of way, right? Faith says, thank you, David. Really trying to figure out what the right frame is to view these issues. Oh, and I know, right. Faith, and I enjoy talking to you about it. Thanks, David. Exponential meeting. You're very welcome, Liliana. Great. Me welcome, Alina and Lauren. Great. Thanks, everyone. Thanks for so many of you coming on and participating and bearing with us with all the discussion and so forth. Glad to do it. Have an awesome week. And I'll try to announce the topic once I figure it out for next week.